Everyone.
Okay, so we're live now. Well, not live, but we're recording.
Recording,
Um,
yeah.
so today I am happy to have Trey with me from telosbound on YouTube, and then you guys know O.G Rose. He's a more familiar one on my
The crazy
channel,
one, yeah.
the crazy one.
Yeah.
And obviously my clear portrayal will be noted today as Trey asks his questions to Daniel. So today, yeah, we're gonna talk about Boober a little bit, and I think it will be an interesting conversation to have because we'll have Trey's input on Heidegger, maybe even Zizek, and you, Daniel, you have like a nice. I always like your David Humean understanding. Like you always bring him up because I know you love him. And maybe Kafka. Maybe we can talk about Kafka too. I don't really know much about Kafka, but yeah. So let's talk relation, and let's go into. I guess we can go straight into Trey, right? From your understanding, Trey, does Heidegger have relation beyond a it relationship? And if you need clarification on that, give clarification on that. But.
Well, that you would be referring to Buber's concept of the difference between the I-it relation and the I-thou. So I'll admit, I just read him 2 days ago, so I'm still sort of reflecting over it. So I'm going to try and talk a little less about him because I know you've read the book twice already, and I'll try and see, maybe provide a sort of the Heideggerian perspective first, and then we can compare and contrast. So I know you asked that question because you informed me that Daniel doesn't. He doesn't think Heidegger can think relation. Now I don't actually know if I have an opinion on that, but I would say that I think Heidegger would disagree with that. And to answer your question, I would say I haven't thought too deeply about it, but I think Heidegger's distinction between the I-it relationship and the I-thou relationship would be his distinction between concern and similitude. Concern is the care that Dasein has for ready-to-hand things in the world. Similitude is Heidegger's term for the care Dasein has for other human beings. So according to Heidegger, Dasein with, so Dasein hyphen with is is a fundamental existential of Dasein. So it's an essential aspect of its very being. And it describes the mode of relation Dasein has to other Daseins. So to answer your question, I would say just at face value, without reflecting too deeply on sort of the details of the similarities or distinctions, I would say that that Heidegger does indeed have a term, not only the conceptual space for the distinction between the I-it relationship and the I-it and the I-thou relationships. He actually has the terms themselves, and that's the distinction between concern for things and the similitude towards other Daseins. So yeah, that's what I would say on that.
Okay.
First off, that's the last time I'm going to send any message to Javier on Twitter about a working ideas that I'm having on somebody, because you're going to get Trey from telosbound to do a hit job, and I hope he's paying you real good, Trey, to carry out that hit job. So first off, I did not say that Heidegger cannot think relations. The notion is that relations are not primary to Heidegger. So you're not even setting up Trey for a good job. You're setting him up to shoot a false bullet on the middle of YouTube. That's real good. The issue is so a few things. Dasein is not a subject. All right. So, what he's trying to do is get to the question of, all right, can we think of, because he thinks the entire, as I understand it, the entire notion of thinking subject has run its course. And in fact, subject has kind of reached an endpoint where it almost has to lead to a kind of deconstruction, almost very problematically. So it's like, all right, so how can we rethink being and not just beings per se, like another object among beings, because that's going to be part of the subject-object dichotomy that the Enlightenment gave us and that we've been working with that has been very problematic. So he wants to rethink our relations with basically it's about tearing down a traditional relation with objects so that things can disclose themselves to us in a new way. And one of the ways he wants to do this is by talking about Dasein as not a subject, but if we speak very generally, and any Heideggerian expert like Dr. Johannes, who sees this, who's throwing up in his mouth for every detail I get incorrect, he can, correct this, whose channel is quite magnificent, where Dasein is a being for whom being is a question. What does it mean to be a question? So you go through, the big mistake is that Heidegger starts off as an existentialist, precisely so that he can eventually move aside existential concerns, even move aside the being of Dasein, so that being itself can come through in its radical suchness. Now, one of the ways I think to look about Heidegger, if we set him up within a Bubian framework, because I think for me, like you were asking me to talk about David Hume, which I'm always happy to do, I think there's a way in which I would want to expand I-it versus I-you into something where I would say ego-it can then become I-it, can then become I-suchness, can then become I-you, and then maybe even a kind of I/you, which is an even deeper state that might get us into things like absolute knowing or different things like that. I think actually the very fact that we are not able to have being disclose itself to us in itself, it cannot turn into suchness, and therefore the I cannot actually be ready to encounter I-you. So Heidegger becomes a necessary step. What I would say is I'm not sure if Heidegger emphasizes the question of Dasein relating to another Dasein, if you will. Because once you do that, I think you do end up having to reintroduce subject concerns, existential concerns, and things like that. Now, at the same time, just because a thinker does not emphasize something, I would not say does not mean the thinker doesn't make space for that, nor does it mean that they are necessarily against that. However, one of the reasons why, as I understand it, Heidegger did not like Sartre very much. He really did not like Sartre. But I think there's something to be said that once you start saying, okay, I've theoretically gone through the phase where I'm able to let being disclose itself to me and encounter I-suchness, well, then you almost have to build back up to existing as a subject. Now you're a subject that has been informed by Dasein, so you're not going to fall into simplistic subject-object dichotomies, but you are going to be encountering subject relations to other subjects, because they, for one, will, in a sense, subject you to their interpretation of you. They will subject you to their hermeneutical understanding of what you're saying, and then you have to learn to operate through that. But now that you've been informed by suchness, as opposed to itness, that can effuse and transform the nature of the relation. But that has to be built back too, which is how, for me, if I'm thinking about Heidegger, how Heidegger can get to Buber, that would be sort of a way that I would do it. But I don't think relations are an emphasis in Heidegger. And for me, because it's not an emphasis, perhaps there is space to actually make room for thinkers like Sartre in a Heideggerian framework, as long as we understand that Sartre has to be a phase after Dasein, but it cannot replace Dasein. So it has to enter, like I was saying, either a Humean journey, as I like to talk about, or you could even talk about, as Dr. Lass does, a Hegelian phenomenological journey. Like it has to be a certain stage in the process. But don't hire frickin' Trey to do hit jobs. I mean, again, poor Trey setup. So those would be some of my initial thoughts to the question.
Sorry about that. I just cut out a bit.
You can cut out all you want. If he's not paying you enough, then you just cut out and drop the call. Oh, my phone's not working. Yeah, if he's not paying you enough, I understand, Trey.
Trey, do you have a response to?
Soon.
Yeah. Okay. But well, Daniel, good job. I am sorry that.
No, well, if somebody wants to say that, again, I'm always hesitant to say a thinker doesn't think X, Y, or Z, or they got X, Y, and Z wrong, because then I go back and reread them and I'm like, oh, I missed that. Oh, I didn't think that. Like, I think it becomes easy to play that game. Whereas just the very effort of Heidegger having to separate Dasein from subject, use existentialism as a method, as a way to get to questions of being, not to stay in existential. Like, there's this whole huge project. I think you can, this is what I would say, but I'm not sure. And I would let a Heideggerian expert correct me. There could be a point where one could say that Heidegger works down to the place where being can disclose itself in suchness. And maybe he doesn't have time in his career, or he doesn't get back to the building back from the experience of suchness in a way that would reconstitute the subject, informed by that suchness, to then relate with others in different ways. Maybe that would be something you could say, but I would have to think on this.
Trey, are you able to, you think you're good now? Maybe not.
The joys of technology. I tell you what.
Yeah. But I will say, Daniel, I think, because I keep thinking about what Trey said, and then what I think Buber might say is that Buber leaves open or leaves unclarified how the I-it relation is, in a sense of like, how do we transition? It is sort of, it is kind of unclear about how we transition, even though Buber says, like, you have to be presenting your whole being and always be sort of turning towards your destiny and accepting the present. But of course, accepting the present, and this is where I think your theory is actually kind of good, and I think Buber would agree, is that Buber says in order to accept the present, you have to presuppose that you have gone on as being a separate being for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So he already acknowledges that you have already gone through some type of suffering, some type of separation, to where now you sort of see the futility of this separation, and now you are accepting the present and you're going to present your whole being. But I think Heidegger, if we include Heidegger, what we can say is that actually Heidegger is proposing a new relation to the I-it.
Yes, that's correct.
Which would prepare us for an I-thou.
Yes, that's what I would like to say. And does one, like, this is the question, does one hold against Heidegger that he's specializing on that question, which would then inform the possibility of a transition to IU? I don't, because, like, it's basically impossible. We were saying at the net, we walk into a workplace, we don't expect the guy driving the truck to also do the taxes and the office work. Yet when it comes to thinkers, we expect them to do everything. Right? It's kind of a terrible tendency that we have, I guess, maybe because of the myth of the genius or something like that. I think if I think about, because I think it is lacking, and you can correct me if it's wrong, but whether we go through Between Man and Man, I think his essay in that on Kierkegaard is actually of note. That should be brought up on the single individual paths of utopia, different thing. There are questions of how does one be able to step into IU? It's clear that we need to, but it's not exactly self-evident how one does that. Likewise, I think it would be fair to say that there's definitely space in Heidegger for relation, but does Heidegger go into the details of relation? Maybe not. There's apparently a ton of Heidegger that has never been translated out of German. So I don't know what that says. But there's something like Gary Chapman's Love Language, or books on how introverts and extroverts that are kind of pop culture-y stuff. But even books like that can actually offer little nuggets here and there that can help you figure out how to relate, even though those could be seen as silly books. Is stuff about Gary Chapman Love Language included in Heidegger? No, but I think there's space in Heidegger for it, dang it. I think there's space. I have not written the paper, and I've thought about it a lot. Indeed, Sartre is basically treating Dasein as a subject, which I do think is a mistake. But if you were to say, go through being and nothingness and kind of say, okay, well, that's not quite correct, there's a lot in there that's actually quite useful for how we find ourselves dealing with other people. And what does that look like? And that would get us into all of being and nothingness. Should we not, as thinkers, try to carry out that act of saying, okay, yeah, I think Sartre was wrong about that, but and go on. Now I can go into Sartre, but I will abstain. But I think that's an important question. So another example. All right, I think Buber is completely correct that Kierkegaard ends up treating God in terms of an I-it relationship because the you gets in the way of God, right? Okay, I think he's completely correct about that. Where in a funny way, you could say Kierkegaard ends up a Gnostic, which would be very interesting because he kind of hated that stuff. But how do we get from and also I think Buber's category of I-it is actually a step ahead. It actually needs to even go back where you say ego-it in a way, because the I is not the same as the ego. And I think he knows that. I'm not saying he doesn't know that, but I would include a category of ego-it. Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, for that matter, can help us get from ego-it to I-it, right? But then you need to bifurcate I-it, I think, from I-it into I-suchness. Heidegger can help you get from I-it to I-suchness. Once you get to I-suchness, then you have developed the ability to make the transition to I-you, which I would also say can overlay with Hegel's movement from self-consciousness to reason in the phenomenology of spirit. Like, how does one come to the place where they are ready to become other or integrate with otherness to the radical degree that Hegel is talking about, right? I mean, he goes through the slave-master dialectic. He talks about a lot of stuff. But you could argue that Hegel does not have the resources that could be found in a Kierkegaard or Nietzsche, even though Hegel in the phenomenological structure of the movement from self-conscious to reason is exactly correct. So you go to other thinkers to perhaps fill in the practical details of what are needed to make those transitions, in my view. I don't hold it against the thinker that there are other thinkers that one may need to go to fill in those practical thinkers in those. Am I going to say that, Buber's completely wrong because I think I-it needs to be split into I and suchness in a category before that? No, because I see ways that you can work it. Am I going to say that works of love or fear and trembling is all nonsense because Kierkegaard unintentionally ends up in a I-it relationship relative to God following Buber, of which is the ultimate heresy, basically, because once you treat God as an it, that's like as bad as it gets. Am I going to throw out all of Kierkegaard because of that? No. I'm going to try to fit Kierkegaard within a framework like I was describing. That's how I try to read, right or wrong.
I think the problem with Buber is that Buber tries to express this rare glimpse that is not mentioned by other thinkers. I think that is what is kind of special about Buber, but his emphasis on that glimpse is what can cause some problems in terms of like how, Buber already acknowledges that we can't do anything in terms of like, we cannot make the thou, we cannot make the thou confront us. We are always confronted by the thou, but we just have to be ready for that confrontation. And this is where, again, I agree with you that Heidegger, Sartre, Kierkegaard, all these thinkers, if we sort of combine them in various ways about how do we prepare ourselves for this glimpse that Buber is talking about, right? And I think if we incorporate Buber as like the glimpse that discloses being itself, and I think maybe this is probably the difference between Buber and Heidegger, where Buber says or Heidegger says, we can find a way to disclose being in some way, but Buber would say, no, you can't find a way to disclose being unless there's that I-thou relationship. So that would be the disagreement, probably. And I don't know if Trey, I know you're trying to catch up with the talk here.
Yeah, I started on my phone. It just wasn't working, so I had to switch to the laptop. But I'm not actually sure on the full context here, but I did have a comment to make on what Daniel was saying like 10 minutes ago. I don't know. I think it will sort of take us off topic. I don't know if that's fine. It's just on what you were saying. I 100% agree with you. Now that you clarified what you were saying, I definitely agree with you. And what's interesting is you mentioned how when Heidegger talks about Dasein with, you're right that Heidegger doesn't, Dasein with is not something he spends like too much time really getting deep into, right? And it's interesting because, as you said, this is when we start to get into subjectivity and intersubjectivity and all that stuff. And what's interesting about that is because Well, you would say that Heidegger, when it comes to relation, he perhaps, it's not that he can't think it, it's just like perhaps it's a little lacking in it. What's interesting is that for Zizek, it's actually the complete opposite, and it's for the same reason that you mentioned. It has to do with Dasein with, because once we get into the space of intersubjectivity, for Zizek, there's always an alienation, a fundamental divide that is deeper than this primordial being with. Like
Right.
Zizek explicitly says, like his critique of Heidegger, like the central critique is that Heidegger can't think the negativity of the subject that withdraws from otherness and this sort of closed circle of the subject that makes it incapable of truly giving recognition to the other and receiving it. And so there seems to be a sort of naivety in Heidegger's notion of Dasein with, because he's not accounting for the radical negativity, or what Zizek calls the scandal of encountering the other. So there seems to be like Heidegger's issue here seems to be twofold, and I think it has the same root. And for on one side, he doesn't think relation properly, and as a consequence, or perhaps that's one consequence of a deeper problem. And the other consequence is he can't think self-relating properly. So
Right.
these two polar opposites, he's sort of stuck in the middle, where you have this naive notion of Dasein with. So I was wondering what your thoughts on that was.
No, I think it's very good. A few things. So, Thomas Jockin and Johannes had a really interesting conversation where, Jockin was making the point where he said, Heidegger is very much against the reduction of the world to standing reserve, right? Turning into things of what they are for. But if you don't have a metaphysical doctrine of essence, where you say a tree is in its essence X, then what ground do you have to say that it shouldn't be used for lumber, or that it shouldn't be used for different things? Like, if you don't have a robust doctrine of essence, it becomes very difficult to say why standing reserve is a bad thing, right? It would seem that what Heidegger makes the move to say is that the very suchness of the phenomenon in of itself has a certain, a weight, value, and should be honored in a way. There's a sense in which, because of the suchness of the tree, you should witness it, not possess it, if I were to use language that even Mr. Jockin was saying. But then the question would be, I just come along and I go, no, I'm just like, no. So is suchness, I think for me, thinking of Heidegger in terms of, I think you can take him, like Mr. Zaruba will use Heidegger to lead into the Kyoto school, Nishashanti, religion and nothingness, which will get into a real robust doctrine of suchness, which I think indeed objects to really, really learn how to let things in their suchness strike you can train you into the IU. But in Heidegger itself, do you indeed have a doctrine of, like you're saying, self-relating negativity? Like, what ends up happening, I think, Being in Time, as I understand, is not a finished book, right? He gets to the question of kind of the being and being, and he kind of leaves it off in different things, because it would seem that Heidegger struggles to figure out how to deal with intersubjectivity and self, like, how does Dasein relate to itself, right? What does that even look like? Because again, what Heidegger seems to want to do is take subject, break it into Dasein, but then even move aside Dasein, actually, so that the suchness of being can shine through that. Well, then the relation of Dasein to itself is not really taken care of now, is it? That doesn't really come forth. And then the work to actually describe what does it mean when you have being in suchness by itself, for itself, independent of a subject, that doesn't seem like it's there. I don't know. It does not seem like it's there. And that's one of the reasons why I think you do have to fit Heidegger ultimately into other thinkers that are going to give us a better doctrine of, say, interrelativity. I feel as if Zizek's critique, I've always that's a very fair critique. And why actually one ends up needing to, say, go into a Nietzsche or a Kierkegaard, and then ultimately into doctrines of self-relating negativity, and what exactly does that mean? So to me, it's a fair critique. But again, if there's a Heideggerian expert who knows more than I would certainly put it forth to them to correct me on any mistake I might make. But I will also add, again, I want to stress the step of suchness, of really, really having suchness occur, seems like a very necessary step to get to the place of the IU. So in the incompleteness of, I don't want to say the wrongness of Heidegger. I want to say something like the incompleteness of Heidegger, which again, I feel like ultimately every thinker is somewhat incomplete. I don't think that's holding something hard against them. But I do think you have to transition once you get that value of suchness in Heidegger to consider other thinkers. And also, Javier, I do think, I wanted to say on Buber that the you being almost a strike of suchness is kind of a unique thing. And it's almost like, although I would have to think on this, in the same way that Heidegger wants to make a distinction between Dasein and subject, it's almost like Buber is suggesting that there's a difference between this relation and relationship. Like very often as we lose being amongst beings, we actually lose sight of relation amongst relationships. Like, it's almost like he wants to move aside relationships in the same way that Heidegger's like, we've lost the question of being amongst beings. Buber's like, we've lost the power, the magnitude, the question of relation amongst relationships. To me, there's a similar project that kind of is undergone.
Right. And I was wondering, so we're sort of talking about the I, thou, the I, you relationship, which I would agree that Heidegger sort of comes up short there. He's incomplete, as you would say, because as Buber points out, the thou is radically different than the it. And while Heidegger does make the distinction between the being with entities and the being with others, I don't think it's in the same way as Buber, where he actually says that the thou is, in a way, I don't want to use the term infinite, but it's like it can't be circumscribed. It can't. It's not an object, right? It can't be placed in one particular. Like you can't, like an object, be like, oh, here it is, right? It's almost inexhaustible in a way, and like the very relation with the thou is sort of like this. It's an objectless relationship, and that's something I don't think Heidegger can really think. It's sort of like this idea that Dasein is, if we're going to use Heideggerian terminology, the Dasein, the other Dasein. I like to think that. I guess to use sort of my Orthodox Christian terminology, I would say that what Heidegger can't think is the infinite potentiality of the thou, of the other. And this potentiality is based precisely on the term communion or the possibility of relation. I don't think there's really too much of a distinction between Buber's term relation and the Orthodox Christian term communion. I think that there is an infinite potentiality because there is an infinite potentiality for relation, for communion. And right. In the context of God, we would say that while man is finite, St. Gregory of Nyssa talks about how man, in a way, his nature, in the same way as God, can't be known. It's almost infinite in a way, and that we possess an infinite capacity for spiritual union, for relation, for communion. So how do we possess this infinite capacity? It's not because in ourselves, in our own power, we have this power. Like, it's not that we have life in itself, as we say in the Divine Liturgy. Christ is the only existent one. He is the existent one. Everyone else is derivative of that singular existence of the Godhead. But because we are spiritual beings who are capable of forming relationships with others and ultimately with God, this introduces infinity precisely because, unlike an object that can be outside of a relation, we can have like, here's the object, here it is, it's finite. Spirituality is precisely nothing more than relation. And again, rambling, but we have an infinite potentiality for relation, an infinite potentiality for communion. And this is why, in a way, human nature is infinite in reference to God in Orthodox theology. And I would even just say the relationships we have with others, this opens up the space of infinity, the infinity of spirit, the infinity of spiritual union, precisely because we're not dealing with the realm of finite objects, but we're dealing with the infinite realm of communion or relation. So that's what I would say about Buber, and that's why I would agree with you that I don't think Heidegger can think this the primordiality of relation and relation as being infinite in potential.
Well, and I should add, if theoretically you truly could look at a tree and be struck, and I use that example, I guess cat would be better because that's what Buber talks about, right? Like a cat or something. So I had this image of the cat shooting the laser beams out of their eyes when I was thinking Buber with that now. So anyway, if you could theoretically truly 24/7 constantly be struck by the suchness of a tree, sure, maybe that would practically function as a way to resist turning it into standing reserve, as would a doctrine of essence, right? The issue is that even though that is theoretically possible, practically speaking, you know, you got to go to bed, you got to make food and different things like that, right? You know, you cannot literally be struck by paralyzed, almost like a beatific vision almost, by the suchness of a tree in a manner that you honor it, right? Because you have to function. And then you also have to eventually figure out, say, a situation will eventually arise where, you know, there are people who don't have homes and you need the lumber to build those homes. And now you have to make a choice on what you should do. Should you tear down the tree? Should you not? Should you honor it and whatever and so forth? Well, if we start getting into doctrines maybe of essence, teleology, you know, what are things for? Then we get into dignity of human beings. You get like, you kind of expand out so you can make a choice. I think it becomes difficult without a doctrine of, and this was sort of, I think, an implication that Mr. Joachim was making. It becomes particularly difficult to say, figure out how to make a choice regarding the tree once you enter into a tragic situation. Even if in the moment you could have a, wow, you know, the suchness, and maybe Heidegger would say, well, you should never cut down a tree that you don't first get struck by its suchness, right? I think that's what he would say. Then you'll probably make a better decision, and then you just apply that everywhere. So, but maybe you just get Paul's and say, man, that's a really beautiful tree, and then you cut it down and use it for lumber for a factory somewhere, right? That's not necessarily going to stop you from doing that. So it's helpful, but in the same way that really getting struck by the suchness of being, and then the other people who are part of that being can be a very good step. If you don't understand their love language, you may proceed to treat what you think is honoring the suchness of that individual in a manner that they interpret as hate, because, you know, you think gifts are what make relationships happy, and actually what it is talking. So you have to go beyond that. I think also on the notion of the infinity that can kind of arise in relations with communion and different things like that. I think you're correct that is what you need. If I would suggest, and then I'll pass it on, I think Heidegger wants to emphasize the dangers of things like the they, emphasize the chit chat, because these are the things that are very new at the beginning of the 20th century, this sort of mass political body, this mass capitalism that is taking. So there's a big emphasis on the dangers of they. And in fact, I will say this. I think it is a very common mistake to jump into relationships before doing the work of turning ego to I and turning it into suchness. So one can understand the extreme emphasis on the dangers of the crowd, the dangers of the they. But that's why I think Heidegger and even Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, you could say, all have to be fit into a Humean journey, a kind of, you could even use that language of phenomenological journey, where then you move, okay, there is a time for relieving relations, because if you start in relations, it's just the they and the chit chat, and that's bad, but you need to withdraw, but then you eventually have to go back, right? Once you've learned the lessons of suchness. And then at that point, yeah, I think you're right. Like what you're getting at, Trey, is why you can't stay in Heidegger, right? Like you can't stay there. You have to tradition like into, okay, well, what do you say? You got to move into communion, right? Well, that would be moving. And to close the point, I think it's very difficult to relate to people as a communion versus a they, which is bad, without that process of suchness. So Heidegger to me has that role, but you have to move. You have to keep going.
Right. Yeah. I completely agree with that. And I mean, I think this just came to me right now. When we're talking about the they as opposed to communion, I think that's a good contrast, because what makes immersion in the they inauthentic? It's because for Heidegger, instead of possessing a genuine understanding of yourself and your potentiality, you simply receive it from the they. So you receive what this public the public averageness, familiarity, and you receive your being from the they, and you lose yourself to the they. And that's interesting to relate it to the communal ontology, because communion is reception. So in the same way the they, you receive your being, but then it's reciprocation in love. So
Right.
I would say that what the they misses is it's one-sided, in the sense that there's a reception, you receive your being from the they, but you don't have the reciprocation of understanding what exactly one you are and what exactly the they is, because you don't. That's the double inauthenticity of the they. One, you don't truly know yourself, and you don't even know what you're receiving your being from. So there's this general loss of understanding. And just to relate it to a point that I've been thinking about a lot recently, and I believe you commented under the video where I was talking about Zizek and relating object A to the experience of damnation. That's precisely the one-sidedness of the they is sort of an image of the one-sidedness of damnation, where in hell, because there is no more love, the self can no longer love. There is no reciprocation. There is no movement outwards in understanding, but nonetheless, according to the Christian doctrine, the souls aren't annihilated; they continue to exist. So they receive their being in the same way we receive our being from the they. The being that the subject in hell receives is a being that they can't understand. And the reason I would say that is because the subject in hell has been reduced to the pure point of its own self-relating, the failure of its own self-relating, and it's a failure precisely because being is communion, and insofar as they exist, they are receiving that existence in communion with God. But the very mode of their being is in contrast with their subjective attitude. So, like as I was saying, like just to close the point off, just as you were saying that they is sort of the opposite of communion in a way. The reason I would say that, I would like to hear more about what you're talking about in terms of suchness. I don't know how this would relate, but for me, it's more so, it's the fundamental point here is that the they is a one-sided reception of being that doesn't include the reciprocation outwards towards the other, precisely because the they isn't a true other. The they is just like what Lacan would call the big other. Todd McGowan has explicitly said that they is the sort of the infant version of the big other. It's right. So it's like the same concept essentially. So so the they would be in opposition to communion because it's one-sided, in the same way damnation is a one-sided reception of being without the reciprocation outwards that constitutes true being as communion.
No, I think that's brilliantly put. And, a few things. One, if I were to simplify, so I'm talking suchness out of the conversations with, say, Daniel Zaruba, the Kyoto School, and different pages kind of form where being discloses itself, as opposed. I think a simple way to put it for our purposes here would be to say that suchness is when you witness being as opposed to try to possess being. And that we all naturally try to possess things, and then we have to learn how to witness them. And basically the mistake that a lot of us can make by not going through Heidegger is we try to go straight to witnessing people, find out that's really hard, and then we end up possessing them when we mean to witness them. And in fact, we kind of almost need to step back, go through the process of first changing from an ego to an I, then learn how to witness things, so that we get to the place where we can take suchness. Now we might be in a place, because we're an I, where we can witness others as opposed to possess them. And now they're a you. And now the possibility of communion emerges. Now, a hanging question, because the theological points that I find very interesting. A question that I have that, again, I think is actually a hanging question that is not really addressed, that I find very interesting. Very often theology will talk about as God as the first mover, the ground of all being and so forth. But something that's often forgotten is that God is also the sustaining of being, right? That he kind of sustains being. One of the things that, again, that is an interesting question is, how do you sustain suchness without belief in God? So how do you sustain you without belief in God, right? I think it's certainly possible to have glimmers of you, glimmers of suchness, but sustaining communion, that's something that, like, if we take Christianity, Jesus is like, you got to do it even if it gets you killed, man. Oh, the sinner that you don't like being around, yeah, you got to do it. Because, basically, it would be hard for me. without that kind of Christian thrust, let's say you encounter someone and you treat them like a you, and 3 weeks go by and they're a you, but then you find out that they've never watched they've never watched Cowboy Bebop or whatever. Now they're an it, right? Because that's an unforgivable sin. So how is it once you start saying, well, there's really good reason then that this person shouldn't be treated like a you because maybe they've done something immoral or they've done something wrong, but they're not a good person. Christ comes along and it's like, well, you don't get to do that because you're a sinner as well. So you're not allowed to cease sustaining the you relationship because of moral judgment or difficulty or different things like that. And I think sometimes, and it would be a conversation, the problem of trying to sustain suchness and ergo sustain communion, if you get there without belief in God, is quite difficult. Because what you have now today is emphasis on beyond good and evil, which, don't get me wrong, of course, as we know from Nietzsche, good and evil are used for master-slave dialectics. It's moved to control different things. But you actually do need a sort of ethic of how do you sustain suchness when, the person's a jerk or the person is not nice. What do you look, and can beyond good and evil doctrines supply people with that or not? I think that's a very robust conversation that, again, is something I think about quite a lot.
Right. Yeah. And just sort of to go to the beginning of what you said, something struck me just as brilliant with your extra added concept of the ego. Is it ego it?
Ego it is what it, yes.
Right. And I like how you related it to possession, or you said that the suchness would be, what is it, encountering as opposed to possession?
You're witnessing versus possess. Yes.
Right. And I think that's such a good point, because I think the ego-it relationship would be defined by possession, wherein the ego sort of, it possesses an object, but in this possession, you're negating its otherness. So yes. It's actually more the ego-it relationship ultimately, and I think this is sort of the something that Christianity really gets. The ego-it relationship, which we can call idolatry, improper relation towards object, it ultimately ends in the ego-ego relationship, where we it's just this. But I think the ego-it already imminently has that ego-ego relationship in itself, because as Byung-Chul Han says, the problem of today's society isn't the disappearance of others, it's the disappearance of capital O, the other. So we're no longer have this encounter with otherness, but we have a repetition of the narcissistic self, the ego. And I think that would be like the perfect definition of possession, as opposed to the witnessing or the encounter. So, and just to I sort of want to connect this to a point that I finally grasped about confession in Christianity. I realized that, like, why is, like, a Protestant critique of Orthodox and Catholics and sacramental churches is, why do you need confession? Why can't you just confess right to God? Well, don't you notice that if you commit a heinous sin and you confess to God, I would, from my personal experience, it is less shameful, less embarrassing to confess in front of God than to confess in front of the priest. So what does that mean? It means that I don't truly have God yet, because I am still in the ego-it relationship, where I don't see God as a true other. Because if you truly thought God was there, if you truly had that faith or that knowledge that he is there, the shame, this is something saints in our church have talked about. The saints of the church, talk about how if God, you truly knew God was there, you would die from shame. That is how serious it is. And that sort of answers the reason of, why doesn't God just appear to us? Well, you want God to appear to you in your sinful state. You want to know absolute truth while you are in a mode that is incapable of communing with that absolute truth. That's precisely why there's a process. And I think that those terms you're laying out, I don't remember them all. They begin with ego, it, and then, right? So I think that is sort of like in Christianity, we call it theosis. It's that process of leaving the ego, entering into the space. And I think that occurs through the leap of faith, because you have your closed circle of your ego. How do you get out? It's the repetition of your ego. You have to have faith. And that same logic of exiting the circle is, there's eye for an eye, but then turn the other cheek. You leave the circle. So I think that that was just a brilliant point you made about possession, and how I think that possession defines the ego-it relationship, as opposed to the true witnessing. Ultimately, for me, it would be the highest form of witnessing is the witnessing of God. And the sort of, not paradox, but the, I would just say the sublimity of Christianity is that in the end, this witnessing that we get ends up being our possession. We get God. We consume the body and blood of Christ, right? So as opposed to Adam, who tried to take life by his own means, which would be an ego-it relationship, we're still going, like, nowhere in the Bible does it say we are never going to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. We just had to get it not on our own terms, because that's just a repetition of our own ego in the form of possession, as opposed to the witnessing and the true experience that defines suchness.
Well, it makes me think, you know, you did your piece on the Orbos, and Chesterton saying it's not very satisfactory. I mean, I love that. You know, the Orbos, the snake eating its own tail, possesses its tail, right? But if it were to, for a minute, witness what it was doing, it might say, this is not a good idea. It may do something else. And, you know, that's simple, so good, because in hell, what is it? You're trying to possess something that is ultimately not there, but you keep going, it keeps going, and, you know, don't get it. Whereas witness is you go, oh, this isn't working, you know, or I'm eating my own tail, and you look outside, and that has a trajectory. Also, what we're describing, indeed, I think it was Cardinal Newman who kind of presented the notion that purgatory is getting clean to present before holiness, because, and also very important, and I like to overlay Dante and Hegel, you know, when Dante's talking with Beatrice, and Dante's like, I guess Canto 22 or something, I'm not sure, and he's like, why won't you smile for me, Beatrice? And Beatrice is like, literally, it would kill you, because you are not high enough up where I could smile in the glory of it, not like it destroy you, right? So now as he gets higher up, then Beatrice's lips can smile more and more, right? But he has to go through the process. There is no way to get to God except through the process, ergo God's hiddenness, right? You know, that's why you have to have the hiddenness. One of the great problems today is that people are trying to get into relationships without going through the process of moving from ego to I, from I-it to I-suchness. They're just jumping right into friggin' relationships. And they're not ready for them. They create a lot of pain, you know, because they're entering into relationships that don't entail communion, right? And so that creates all sort of neurosis, you know, neuroses, pathologies, and different things like that. We are a very, I guess you could say, philosophically, whatever, anti-process people. We don't believe in process. We don't believe in journey. We really don't. We say we do. We believe in a career track. We believe in like a career ladder. But when you start talking about some sort of subject process, we'll be like, oh, you mean going to school? No, we're not talking about going through 1st to 12th grade. We're talking about this like deep, like development of the project. And religion, if we speak generally Christianity, indeed had a sense of this. If you talk about sanctification, Protestantism, unfortunately seems to have conflated sanctification and salvation, and as a result an element of a process of development in salvation was de-emphasized in favor of a right beliefs, which ends up Cartesian, and there's no real process there. There's simply a you were wrong, now you're right, now spread the rightness, right? So it's very kind of binary, and there's not really process thinking. Likewise, I think what ends up happening is when we read philosophers, we actually carry that sort of mode to looking for the right philosopher versus the wrong philosopher, as opposed to thinking of philosophers as steps on a process that have very necessary roles, even if there is incompleteness, so that you can advance to the next stage. You don't really, again, I stress, I would not suggest trying to enter into IU before you've learned Heidegger, right? Before you've gone through Kierkegaard and Hume. But I would say, here's the funny thing. If we take Hegel's notion of progress, as I understand it, which is progress is contingent. And let's say you move from self-consciousness, you move from consciousness to self-consciousness, and you get to reason, but you don't ever make it to spirit. It's like it works backwards, and it's like you didn't make any progress at all, right? That's what's so weird. It's like it wasn't any good. You have to go all the way to the end to then kind of work back, and it's all good. It all works towards something. Where there's something similar at play, where if you stop at any point in this process that I'm describing, from ego that to Kierkegaard to here, and if you don't make it like to the communion, and then sustain the communion, sustain the you, and this is the big theological edge, I think. And I do think theology has better resources for sustaining that you, and that would be another question, and people can disagree and so on and so forth. But Well, I will also say I think theology was actually aware that that was a problem. I think theology actually was like, oh, it doesn't really do you very much if you don't sustain the communion or have the development as a person to sustain relationship. That's the whole trick. That's why the emphasis is on marriage. Being married, not the wedding. Marriage is very different from finding someone to get into to wed you. Right. The sustaining is a very big emphasis that is not, I think, brought out in philosophy very much. Different subject. But the point is, there's this notion that you have to go through the whole, or it's as if you didn't go through anything at all. And you have to get to that communion and sustain.
Right. I completely agree. Sorry. Do you have a, sorry.
Yeah, you're good. Just briefly, there is something I want to slowly retract from a little bit to point out something about Heidegger, and something that you guys already pointed out, right? Is Heidegger begins with sort of assessing being and understanding of being from the everydayness, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly what's kind of missing, is that actually there is this idea within our very everydayness that isn't everyday. And I think that's the part that is missing, right? That, when you said Dante is encountering Beatrice and she's saying, you aren't not going to be sort of ready, right? That is not something that smile that Dante wants is not going to be something that he can encounter in his everydayness. He has to sort of do something very specific to encounter something that is not everyday, which is that smile. And that's why I feel we could say is kind of missing in Heidegger, where Heidegger already begins from the everyday. But what is the everyday in preparation for? That is my question. What is the everyday in preparation for, which is a very unique question. And the other thing is that struck me while you guys were talking is that Heidegger says, okay, we already have an understanding of being, right? But there is this multitude and plethora of understandings of being. In my opinion, Buber can actually answer the pre-ontological question of why we have an understanding of being. We could say actually everybody has a certain understanding of being because they encountered a kind of thou.
Right.
That solidified and then led an understanding of being. Right. Yes. But instead he tries to abstractly extract from an understanding of being, which Buber says himself that just a constitution of just existence is an empty concept, right? Buber, this is like Buber's critique of Heidegger, this. But I still think actually it is bewildering, and Heidegger, and I agree with Heidegger in this, that we already have an understanding of being, but why is it that everybody already has a different understanding of being, right? And I think actually using Buber kind of answers this question, right? A variety of religions, and I think this is where the more anthropology comes in, about why is it that we already encounter different understandings of being. And I know I was going to say something more, but yeah, that was it.
No, I mean, there's a way to take Heidegger as suggesting that it's dangerous to use lowercase and uppercase letters in these contexts, but it helps communicate the point. There's a sense in which Heidegger is saying that we are lost in lowercase everydayness, and so we're not struck by the capital everydayness. That's he's like we're not struck by it. It's so given to us that we've lost the fact that why is it given to us, and what is this thing that's given to us, and we're not mystified by the suchness of the everyday, right? We're just too busy using the hammer to go, wait, whoa, and so I think, but again, that's where, but you all know my big thing is to always talk about the loss of aesthetic philosophy was a huge freaking problem. The loss of, if you take the doctrine of what beauty is as not mere aesthetics, and why it is very important that there can be this notion of God being aligned with beauty, or there being something about beauty that transforms being. Because for me, I like to emphasize intrinsic motivation, which that's kind of when everyone's talking about a new kind of being or different things like that. To me, a kind of very straightforward way to think about it is where there's a lot of extrinsic motivation, and there needs to be a move into intrinsic motivation, which transforms the way that one deals with being, frankly. Because if you're intrinsically motivated, there's a sense of goodness, truth, and beauty that permeates one's life that results in there being an intrinsic motivation and intrinsic movement. And so, but no, I mean, what you're getting at, and then I'll pass it on, is it, I think one can think how you move from consciousness to self-consciousness is in fact the encounter with the other person. Like, oh, I guess I must be conscious, and I must be conscious in a manner that is divided from the other person after you have established sense certainty. But then, of course, the question that then presents with you is, what will your relation as becoming other be? Will being for self integrate with becoming other, ergo step into reason, and then, Hegel go on from all of that. If one wanted to posit why perhaps Heidegger starts with an emphasis on just the question of being, without really asking where the question came from, why do you even have that question? Because that would get you into this kind of the subject, right? And it would be difficult then to, after you've kind of brought in the relation and therefore the subject element, that's a whole nother boatload of work you would have to engage in just to bring it back. It's like, to get back to the question of being, so you could move on Dasein. So perhaps, not that I know, the question of where does the question of being come from is skipped, because that would open a door to a lot of other questions. Based on the relation, the encounter with the other person. But again, I don't blame Heidegger for doing that, because my gosh, he does being and time. He does all the work that he does on suchness. But that would be a speculation I'm not sure about, but I think you're asking something interesting.
Right. Yeah. That was an interesting question. And I don't know if I have a good answer to it in terms of how do we have all these different notions of being, or even when you were mentioning how Buber's critique of Heidegger, when he states that being is nothing, it's an empty concept. Obviously, that's a Hegelian idea as well. Pure being negates itself because it is nothing. I would just say that for me, based on my Orthodox Christian ontology, I would say that being is communion, and this overcomes the pure notion of pure being, which is nothing, because being always has some content, because being always already is communion. Being is communion. So, of course, for Hegel, he was trying to think, he began with being, but it's purely self-relating. No determinations, no otherness, no difference. Obviously, he demonstrated how otherness was immanently inscribed, but at face value, the concept itself was a pure self-relating. And obviously, it's no surprise from an Orthodox perspective that obviously this pure self-relating notion turns out to be nothing, because being is communion, hence self-relation is nothing. So I would just say that there is no pure being as such, because being always has a specific content and only ever emerges in and through and as that content, right? So we would say that in terms of the nature of God, it's a condemned heresy to say that you have the nature of God, and then maybe you have the three persons of the Trinity rotating around it, right? It's rather that the very relationship between the three persons constitutes the divine nature. The divine nature itself is the content of the communion between the three persons, right? So for us, there is no pure being. And even for us, there is no universal being in that sense, because all being is already possesses content, and it possesses content as communion. Now, I'm just going to go back, and I just want to hear your answer in this, because I find it really interesting. This is completely off topic, but when you were talking about the ego it, and you begin with the ego it, I would propose, for me, I would actually begin with the zero level of that sort of egoism, we could call it, is in reference to my recent video on object A, would actually be ego-A. So ego relating to itself first, as sort of the failure of it. And then, for me, that would be sort of the basis. I would introduce the extra term of ego A, or self-relating, obviously in the form of a failure, because there is no pure self-relating. So I would add that. But again, I just want to remind remind you that I still want to hear the answer on the Heideggerian.
No, it's actually really funny you bring that up because I started a paper kind of thinking about all that, and I was wondering if before ego id, I was thinking about before the mirror stage. In the Kyoto school, they're going to talk about like the pure experience where you're not like before the mirror stage where there's a separation of I and it. They talk about that. I was like, oh, maybe we should get into that. But in the paper, it was kind of like an emphasis on the phenomenological journey of the subject. But I think you could easily. I also would say in the paper, I started to kind of go. Maybe it's possible. This is why I go back and forth on that. You could actually have, as I was saying, like ego, it, and then I, it. Maybe you could do an ego suchness and then go to I suchness. I'm not sure if the order for every single person has to be very set. And likewise, maybe for some people, they don't have as much of the ego A, and there's a little bit more of the ego A, but I definitely think you could add that. I would not have any trouble with that at all. So I think I was trying to actually read, I was wondering, and this is where I started to get too many notes, if Heidegger makes a very good argument for why actually I suchness has to come before I you. Or that, that's why I think Heidegger might actually kind of provide arguments for the order that has to go in, and that's what I was thinking about.
I would say that he does, because he emphasizes that, for example, something like an inauthentic way of being, right? That's always a modification of the existential form of Dasein. I'm not saying it right, but like it's like even if we're not based on temporal logic here, like once, like in its infancy, Dasein was whole and it was authentic, right? But there's sort of for him like a logical precedence of the, like, for example, Dasein always possesses an understanding of itself, and it's only on the basis of this primordial understanding that it can modify itself and possess a lack of understanding. So I would agree with you when you say that. I would say Heidegger probably would say that I suchness comes first, at least logically it precedes it, and that all like the deformed modes of that way of being, like ego it, ego a, yes, I it, these are all sort of modifications of the primordial suchness, or even just understanding of being that Dasein always already primordially possesses, even if it doesn't know that it does.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's what I kind of in the paper. And like you're saying with ego, ajaya, one of the questions that I kept kind of going back for is how does the baby, if the baby is put, if we're thinking like really Freudian or something, and the encounter with the mother on the tit, is that an I-it relationship, right there, or not? That's where I'm not sure. But I think what you're putting forth, Trey, is very valid.
Just to comment, I do think that, Heidegger, like I said, we've been saying, like Heidegger sort of prepares this relationship. But what I think is fascinating is that Heidegger, I don't know, like when I think Buber, like it seems for like Heidegger, when he talks about like the readiness at hand and everything, it seems like very clear cut that, this is meant for us and everything like that. But when you include Buber, like even an artwork, you can encounter the thou, like glimpsely, right? You can, and that's the part that like kind of like it gets very interesting when I start thinking like Heidegger and Buber, is because for Heidegger it's like this very nice like systematic, at least in Being and Time, right? It's this very nice systematic, like, okay, there's the hammer, it is this readiness at hand, and have an understanding of being, and so on. But then Buber provides this little gap within Heidegger and says, like, actually, within that whole possibility of readiness at hand and everything in the encounter, is that you can actually possibly have a glimpse of the thou.
Mm-hmm.
You can have a glimpse of it, and that's what's striking to me. But what I like about Trey's constant work on the subject, right, is that actually Heidegger prepares us, and I think, and of course I might get slaughtered for this, I think Heidegger prepares us for the idea that the understanding of being ultimately fails, Understanding of being ultimately fails. But Buber, and this is where we can fit in Buber, is that we need this understanding of being that fails in order to enter into actual relation. Like that's the problem, is that I, live my life with an understanding of being, whether I consciously or unconsciously know it, and that prevents me from entering into relation because I don't quite see that failure, right? And so everything that you guys have laid down is basically like we have to go through a series of a variety of failures, ego, objet, kind of like thing, and sort of I suchness. But yeah, this preparation is that ultimately, no matter what understanding of being I have, it has to fail so that there can be this relation. And I actually think Heidegger's sort of, when he says like there's this, the Dasein is sort of being held over the nothingness. I think that nothingness is the failure, and it actually shows the possibility of relation itself. And that this nothingness is the peak, the window into the relation itself that is necessary. So that means that Heidegger is bringing us closer to that whole that Buber is talking about.
I would just say really quickly that I would just say that I completely agree. And I think it's because Heidegger tries to understand being in terms of self-relation. Dasein tries to question, what am I? But we know from Zizek, we just know this from basic logic, that you can't pull your eye out and stare at yourself. You can't, consciousness is always in a way unconscious. And I think it's through, reconciling yourself with the impossibility. And I think that this sort of, as you were saying, it manifests as the nothingness precisely because it's experienced as nothingness, because it's an other that we can't, as an ego, as you would say, Daniel, as the ego, we can't possess, right? So it's like, as God, right, apophatic theology, we have to understand God in terms of negation. And even St. Dionysius the Areopagite, he even says that we can say God is nothing. Why can we say that? It's because no terms can circumscribe his essence. So just to finish up and pass it off to you, Daniel, I would just say that I completely agree. And the reason why Heidegger, why the Dasein's understanding of itself and its being fails is because Heidegger's thinking in terms of self-relation. And I think at the moment of failure, I think this opens up the space for recognizing through, I would say, grace, because I think it's completely impossible to accept that you're finite without grace, external grace, not just external grace working through you. I would say that it's through the failure that you come to recognize and reconcile yourself with your own finitude. And this precisely is the basis for the entering into communion, which gives you true knowledge, being, and experience of God.
No, so something I think for me, what I think is very important is I do think Heidegger had a sense of this problem, but what he does is he tries to locate the answer in death. Death is how he tries to address all of this. But you see, because there's not a space for self-relation in Heidegger, he can't go into the subject and find the subject. So it has to be being toward death, not like into death, right? And there is a good argument to be made that if you really, really took seriously death, like he said, and Johannes is right to really emphasize death in Heidegger. Like, it's a big freaking deal. And Heidegger, I think, if to what I was about to say, if you really took seriously the fact you were going to die, then that could, in fact, have some positive impacts on the way that one carries themselves in the world and come to terms with the problem of finitude and all the things that we were saying. This I might be, if I were to put forth maybe a more, I want to say, critique of Heidegger, that might be a little harsher. But again, I resist. So Heidegger has told us that boredom is boredom's a problem, chit chat's a problem, alienation, all these different things. And it seems to be that he believes that really taking death seriously would shake one out of their dogmatic slumber and have suchness arrived again. I think it's actually the opposite. Once you're bored, you don't care if you die. I think actually death loses its power to do what Heidegger wants it to do in the very conditions that he sees arise in modernity. And actually, that's where you need self-relating negativity. That's why death will not have the function that Heidegger wants it to have. And in fact, you need to do the self-relating negativity, exactly what Trey was saying. But he's cut himself off from going in that direction in his project for all the reasons that we've said. But I do, to his defense, want to say that I think he was aware, but he just makes the solution, if you will, or management being toward death. And again, perhaps that works for some people. I think, again, what are the interesting dimensions of religion? To make, hey, die to yourself. Death is central to it. But here's the other thing. This is where Buber, I think, is correct. The other reason, why does Heidegger also stress death? Because he wants to transform relation to time, right? He wants to change your relationship to time, being in time. Buber kind of comes along and he's like, hey, so I got this idea of IU. It's going to have a lot of the same impacts as being toward death. And you're really going to feel it, actually. When you really encounter a modernity, post-modernity, hyper-modernity, modernity with a cherry on top, you really encounter that. The you, if you take it seriously, never loses its power. Whereas death, in the condition of boredom and modernity, can lose its power. Oh, and by the way, the you is always in the present. So you get that transformation of time that Heidegger wanted with death in the encounter of the you. So for me, Buber's you is trying to have the same effect as death does in Heidegger. And the you can work in boredom. Death doesn't live, where death still, you don't even care if you die anymore. And it can work in a schema of self-relating negativity. So the you becomes more robust, if you will, because it also transforms time, exactly as Buber is stressing. What that brings me to is the thing I think about, because I was thinking about this, it's almost like, if we're talking communion, because I love that language, it's almost like what we're describing is a movement to a kind of, this is the term. So we've talked about how we're a self-relating negativity, and you stick into that and you try to possess it, it's hell. It's almost like this language of we need to be self-relating sublations or self-relating sublation negativities, where the you is by which we relate to ourselves, which is something that has to go outside of ourselves. So this is kind of, if you is taken in the Bubian sense, we have to move from self-relating negativity to you-relating negativity. Or I'm not sure if I want to say negativity. If you mean that in the sense of maybe sublation, but that's always a dangerous term, or negation/sublation. I'm still working on the language. But something like a you-relating, with the you being Buberin. And then the issue is that we have to go, this whole time we've been talking about this kind of phenomenological journey, to sustain a you-relating negativity. One must go through this journey that we are describing. Otherwise, they will not be able to sustain it. Otherwise, it will be like Beatrice's smile that destroys you and kills you, and you're not ready for it. So there's something about a process of coming to the place where you can sustain a you-relating negativity that seems quite paramount, and where all of these thinkers have roles to play into getting into that place.
Would you say, Daniel, that for Heidegger, death, the problem with Heidegger's notion of death is that we're always being towards it, so it's sort of always external to us, right? It's always out there, and we have to reconcile ourselves with the future inevitability of our death. And obviously, like death, like the final death of our body, as I would say, the cutting off of the soul from the body. This is this is like a huge. It's bigger than all of our, let's say, our everyday confrontations with death in the sense of negativity. But that's precisely what I think Heidegger misses. And I think that's what you're trying to say with connecting it to self-relating, right? Is that Heidegger sees death as external, but wouldn't the Hegelian move, as always, is to show that the externality, the otherness, is always imminently already an imminent aspect of our very identity. So as I think the perfect line for this is from the preface to the Phenomenology, where Hegel says that the life of spirit, not going to be an exact quote, it's not the one that shrinks from death, but rather, and he explicitly identifies death with the negative. And what does the spirit do? It tarries with the negative. So I think that what Heidegger's missing is that he's saying, oh, we have to confront ourselves with the future possibility of death, without realizing that death, negativity, our destruction, our own inner death drive, even, this is always already here. So and I think that's what you're trying to get at with self-relating, and originally connecting that the whole thing to death. I envy you for that brilliant point. I should have made it.
Well, what's very important, I should clarify, the encounter of the you encounters a kind of death. So in Buber, the you can include the death where the death doesn't necessarily include the you, right? Like,
Right.
you know, to be being toward death, that doesn't necessarily include the you, whereas the you includes the death, right? But it makes it far more freaking real. And this is why, you know, I really love the part in Sartre's Being and Nothingness that I think is very profound with the pinning down. You know, he's got the guy looking through the keyhole and he's staring on a girl change, and then he hears something, looks behind, somebody sees him, and then boom, he's pinned down, like I always associate with the butterfly with the wings. In that moment, that, well, one, that's a hell moment. You're encountering like what you really are, and you're having to relate to yourself as someone who like spies on girls, and you're like, oh my gosh, what kind of being am I? Whereas before the gaze, you never had to see yourself that way, but the gaze has this function of making you see yourself. So there's a kind of depth that one has to undergo, you know, with your fantasies of who you might be. So likewise, the encounter of the you, this is what's so interesting. Buber's you can have a purgatorial function. Like I like to say, you can't get to Buber's you unless you go through Sartre, right? You have to be able to go through the purgatory of Sartre to get to the possibility of the heaven, right? You could almost, I would have to think of this. I don't think it will match on perfectly, but I always am obsessed with Dante. But, you know, the Inferno, Purgatorio, and the Paradiso, you know, the Purgatory, the Inferno is almost the relation with the ego to it. And then you start to move toward, you know, I and it. And then you start somewhere in there getting to where you can say I and suchness. And maybe then you can start working to the I is you. And then in the Paradiso with the Grand Communion, there's something like a deeper I/you or something. Obviously, you know, you relating negativity. I'll have to think of this. But you see, the you can include this death that Heidegger wants. But the thing I want to add is, again, death, being toward death can do what Heidegger wants it to do if people fear death, if people don't want to die, if they care to be alive. But perhaps today, when you have the meaning crisis, when you have the, you know, all of that, mental illness and different things like that, I'm not sure if being toward death can do what Heidegger wants it to do, because death does not have the same function that it may have once had. So therefore, whereas perhaps it was training wheels, dare I say, for the historic spirit or something, to get to the place where it can start talking about the you, it would seem as if Buber's you needs to be what one goes to gain the fruits of being toward death.
Well, actually, Daniel, I really like Trey's and how you guys have been framing this death in you, because actually the play in Heidegger would be like, actually, it would not be being towards death is what we need, but we need a being along with death.
Sure.
Right. So that way you sort of carrying over every time, right? That you understand that when you are along with death, and this would see, this is the part, right? The being towards death excludes relation. Being
Sure.
along with
your death, it's very
yes.
centered. Your
Yes.
death, yes.
Being along with death actually negates the whole idea of somebody like, okay, I'm being towards death, so I'm just going to commit suicide, because there is nothing else that is pushing me to keep myself alive. And so, you know, and this is actually what Lange says in Positive Nihilism. He's like, being towards death doesn't actually answer the fact that if somebody wants to kill themselves, you know, what then, right? What is this?
Exactly.
What they actually, the reason why somebody wants to kill themselves is because they actually have no relation to death. Where we could say actually, maybe in a very just being, you know, sort of kind here to Heidegger, we could say actually maybe Heidegger's intent was actually being towards death was to imply some type of relation. Mm-hmm. Right? By contemplating death, you were supposed to have some type of relation. Maybe that's what it was supposed to be. But actually, I like the reframing, and I got this kind of hint from Trey, is that actually it wouldn't be being towards death. It would be being along with death.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's very good arguments to be made that even like being in the world should be more like being worldling. You know, in German, it's not like being in creates that separation that Heidegger's always. So that's, yes, being toward death easily could be being with death, can easily be a different language. The issue, of course, becomes, does Heidegger give you the resources to sustain? That's been my kind of overarching language. Like, how does one sustain that? And this is where theology is like, hey, what's up? So the sustain question is actually a really big deal for me. But no, I will say this, and then I'll pass it on. There can be extreme if one has not confronted their fear of death, then it is hard to imagine one being able to handle the death of the encounter of the you. So again, Heidegger is a phase. Heidegger has an important role. The problem becomes you almost can have a situation where the historic spirit, if you will, has kind of all collectively said, we don't fear death anymore because we're bored. Okay, well, then that step is not going to be what you need to do. You need to emphasize the you step, because it's almost like Heidegger, the lessons of Heidegger have more generally been integrated into the collective consciousness more in regarding to the being toward death. That would be a way to put it, perhaps.
Yeah. And also, I haven't brought this up, but I think it would be actually very interesting to bring it up. I've been reading some of Toward a Psychology of Being by Maslow.
Oh yeah.
Good old Maslow. Actually, I didn't know Maslow was this good. I do think we can expand more on this relation between I-it and the ego and the way, Trey has been talking about it. But the way that I guess like a healthy psychology for Maslow, and Maslow understands how a healthy psychology is problematic, but he talks about how actually a sick person, right, has a deficiency, which maintains the idea that they need to use consumption to satisfy the need.
Sure.
So this already answers the fact or reason possibility of why we are already in a relationship of I-it, right? Because we are in a state of deficiency where our needs are not satisfied, right? So this is what Maslow would call the sickness and so on. But a healthy person, Maslow says, is somebody that is aiming towards a goal for the sake of the growth itself, not for the goal, right? Which is interesting because actually this already says that a healthy person is already in a mode of being that is aimed at towards becoming itself.
Sure.
Right? They're already obsessed with the becoming itself. So I think it's fascinating that, like, I think it just kind of reemphasizes the journey that actually we do need the I-it relationship. We need to understand that there is that consumption is necessary in terms of like there is a deficiency, but the problem remains is that if we think everything is for consumption, then that we get stuck in the I-it relationship. But in actuality, if you sort of satisfy the needs and overcome and Maslow always says that actually a need is always becomes into a higher notion of need. I think the ultimate need, and this is kind of going above Maslow's, the ultimate need is actually the relation itself, the relation between the I and thou. That is the ultimate need. But we need to begin with a state of deficiency and so on. So, I think it sort of expands more about why the I-it relationship exists at all in the first point, right?
Yeah.
And that maybe possibly Heidegger already begins with a everydayness of being that is already sick, right? And he's trying to reframe your sickness into a more healthier relation. But that does not mean, and I think he does like a Buddha thing. And I don't know why I think about this, where I don't know if you guys heard of the parable of like the Buddha, where this man is dying and he's like, I just need to know, Buddha, does God exist or not exist? And Buddha says, there's no point in me answering that question because you need to sort of get rid of your own poison arrows before you even grapple with that. So I think Heidegger does something similar to that notion where it's like, there's no point of even thinking the I and thou relation if you can't even like begin or know where to start of like picking out your own poison arrows. And I think Heidegger does the work of that.
Right. So I need to go, but I do have a quick response to the last thing you said there. I think that the Buddha is being a little Jordan Peterson-esque there, It wasn't his response just to clean your room. So that's my comment on that one. But I'll say that sorry, I missed most of what you said there. So I'm just gonna go back to the stuff on death really quickly, and then I'm sure Daniel will have a eloquent response to your to what you were just talking about. But for like when you were talking about that was such a good point, how death is sort of like the ultimate form of self-relating, isn't it? Like that's Heidegger's point. Death is radically individual. It is like existential individuality at its barest. And I would just say, now that I'm leaving now, my last point will be that I think the one not system of thought, one religion that overcomes this is Christianity, because you participate in the death of Christ, and Christ is dying in you. So you are dying in Christ, and Christ is dying in you. And through this sort of the overcoming of the self-relating nature of death, which obviously, if death is self-relating, I mean, how do we get communion? You die, and this is probably one of the reasons why a lot of people believe, or a lot of Christians believe, that there is no repentance after death, right? It's this final moment of self-relating. But the I would say brilliance of Christianity is that death doesn't have to be self-relating, because the infinite God has participated in this death in a mode of absolute faith in his Father, so that his very death ended up, the very way he died conquered death itself, right? Conquering death by death. And it's through dying in Christ that we, in a sense, do what Heidegger would say is impossible, which is die in the other. And because the other, and our other has eternal life, when we die in this other, we ourselves, this is a means by which we receive eternal life. So that's all I have to say. Thanks.
You're divine, Trey.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank
you. It was good talking to you, Daniel. It's been too long.
It's been far too long. It was a true treat, Trey. Thank you for coming in. I've enjoyed it immensely.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, guys. Bye-bye.
Yeah, don't you go. I got to talk about your cat, because I want to make fun of your cat. No, anyway, there's a bunch of things. First, someone may counter what I was saying earlier about the world spirit kind of understanding death, and they would say, well, the world's become bored with death. That doesn't mean they're fearless. That doesn't mean they've overcome death. They're just bored with it. So there might be an argument to be made that today we have to actually have the suchness of death hit us again, so that then we can get to the place of IU. So maybe I should not be so quick to say that the world spirit can skip Heidegger because it's already integrated with Heidegger. Maybe it's actually really bad now. It's like we're even further away from taking seriously what Heidegger is teaching. That's a thought I am considering as I was speaking, because being bored with death is not the same as being fearless. Definitely Heidegger, I think Trey is getting at this very well. There's a notion that death is the other, that you will die in death, so you become death. So being toward death is a kind of Hegelian becoming death, becoming the other, and you integrate your death, and then there's a radical otherness that is part of your being. I think you can indeed take death in the function of Heidegger to get you to something like self-relating negativity. This just becomes a question of the language, the resources, and the ways by which Heidegger expands on it that may not be as elaborate and robust as other thinkers, and ones can turn theirs. Also, I think the strong point would be to say that none of us actually become other without an encounter of the you. None of us can have our own death become us to the depths that Heidegger is encouraging us to do on our own. Like, only the encounter of the you has that kind of power. Now, that I think would be the argument. And actually, if you were to ask me myself, I think coming to terms with death was a very necessary role in the philosophy. Oh, before I forget, I wanted to note how strange it is that we talk about biological development, we talk about mental development, but we don't talk about philosophical development. Basically, everything we've been describing, like because you brought up Maslow, there's every other field, everywhere else, there's a notion of development. But in philosophy, it's like right philosophy, wrong philosophy. This has made us stupid. This has made us dumb. If we were to instead think about philosophers as stages in a philosophical development, we would really stop this stupid game of saying who's right and who's wrong and blah, 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 blah. And instead be looking for stages almost, not states. Basically, we're looking for the philosopher that can provide us the best state, as opposed to finding philosophers that are the proper fitting stage for where we are and then go from there. But basically, from my own experience, coming to terms with death is a very, very necessary step in one's philosophical, spiritual, if you want to use again, spiritual development. But I do not think it can do what the encounter of the you can do. Because eventually the fact that you're going to die bores you. Like, because you're like, let me put it, I guess I put it like, you get to 30, 33, 34, 35, you get to work, you know, and you're going to cap, like life becomes life, right? And death, you know, you're going to die because you're getting older. And it actually, I think, can get a sort of like, oh yeah, that's going to happen. Now, if it actually started to happen, I'm not saying there wouldn't be a different emotional impact, but death, even if you know you're going to die, I really do think the you encounter is what brings it back into its emotional impact, because you start to go, oh, there are yous that will continue after me. There are yous of whom I need to change how I relate for them. So die to what I may want to do, die to self in different things. And it is, I think, hard for me to think of, it is hard for me to see death having the function of becoming other that Heidegger wants it to have, that I do not deny could happen for some people, but it is hard for me to see it for a lot of people or in a sustaining manner without the IU. Because that's where death has, that's like, because the you includes the death, even if the death does not include the you. So that would be what I would say. If you were to say, because you set up Trey to attack it, like if you were to say with the incompleteness of Heidegger that I wonder about, it's in that kind of that we are describing there. And not really seeing the relation of the you as having an emotional impact as he wants death to have, that death, I don't think, can sustain having after you come to terms with it. And you need it to have that impact every single day for the rest of your life, right? You know, you need to sustain what Heidegger wants it to do. Let me tell you, if you really, really take the you seriously, that can happen every day of your life. And that quest can be a quest that you find anew and needing to do anew every single day. And so the IU can have the sustaining function that we've been saying we need. Whereas in Heidegger's being, you know, the death can maybe start you, you know, it's a necessary place to get to where you can start that, but to sustain it in the way that Heidegger wants us to have being in suchness, I think the IU becomes very, very critical.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually now that I'm sort of starting to like, we are starting to clarify some things more, is that Heidegger seems to, it's weird. I don't want to say lays in a realm of non-emotion because that's not necessarily true. He does talk about attunement and everything like that. Moods, but it's weird because actually the being towards death actually feels as if there is an emotional gap there, that it is actually very difficult for me to just simply contemplate my death, contemplate my finitude, accept my finitude and just this everydayness. I'm actually I have a more tendency to forget, right, than I would remember or contemplate death. But what's interesting about Buber comes in with the I and thou and says actually that glimmer of the thou makes you realize, right, come to face of faith with that death, and that very brief glimpse already makes an impact on you, right? You could say, actually, I would say this brief glimpse would probably be very similar to actual near-death experiences.
Yes.
I would say, right? Where the near-death experience was so profound to the person. Yes. It completely inverted their whole relationship to the world, to themselves, to other human beings. I mean, that is a perfect example of how one can be towards death, but you cannot willfully do it on your own.
It would be difficult for me to express how glad I am that you brought up the phrase near-death experience, because that's sensible for me for the cultivation of intrinsic motivation. Because for me, the being toward death does not have the emotional impact to create intrinsic motivation, therefore a new type of being, as does the near-death experience, which I associate with beauty. Because everyone that's why I'm always talking about like the fate of beauty is the fate of us, because it's the fate of the near-death experience, if you will, which includes death, but it's not annihilation. Whereas what Heidegger's death is hard not to just say as annihilationism. You know, you could just replace death with annihilation for me in Heidegger, right? You could just say being toward annihilation. Okay. And don't get me wrong, that has a place. And in fact, people getting into marriages, relationships, jobs, and whatever, who have not come to terms with their annihilation as such, end up pathological, dependent, and all the other crap that happens because people have not come to terms with their finitude. But death, when it's annihilation, has a step. But if you want to sustain that impact, it must become near death, in the sense of you must have a constant proximity to death in your life, right? Well, how can you do that? Because you've gone through the intellectual journey of death. So how can death as an emotional concept maintain proximity to you? Oh, people, you. The you is a near-death experience. Because the you can also, there's a bunch of ways you can take that. Because the you could kill you. The you, in a sense, will kill you. You're near death because your ego is being destroyed. It also has an unveiling of surprise. This is very important. Near-death experiences are surprising. They're really surprising. They shatter your ego, reconstitute your entire sense of reality, and so on and so forth. Well, the you does that. Oh, you thought everyone interpreted love X way. You meet a you who interprets love Y way. You thought everyone had the same hermeneutic. You encounter the you. It turns out people have different hermeneutics. It's precisely because of the near-death experience of the you that pluralism is so hard. And the entire global economic system is having so much trouble because everyone's starting to go, oh my gosh, they don't think like me. And now I feel like I'm near death because my ego is being destroyed by the very robust experience of otherness. So the problem is death becomes too quickly a simile for annihilation, and we expect the notion of annihilation to have the transformation of being that Heidegger wants it to have, which he is correct that we desperately need. But the coming to terms with annihilation must be a step on a phenomenological journey to the place where one can be sustained in a near-death experience, which is only brought out by the encounter of the I-you, in the you. And then furthermore, to get to the place where you can integrate the you into the self, into a you-relating negativity, which then makes near-death experience integrated into your very self, which then makes you integrated with beauty, reconstitution, surprise, intrinsic motivation, and that entire new, for me, that's why intrinsic motivation, which gets linked up with near-death experience, is the new being that Heidegger is searching for, or that all these philosophers are talking about, because that is the becoming of the near-death, and that's a new kind of being.
Is it not interesting that we start talking about beauty and annihilation? Is that, and I think even Buber critiques this, and is that death, right? We cannot just look at death as a concept that is, just annihilation in terms of, and I think that this is what Buber's trying to say, is that like actually death attracts life. Death is literally the sucking wound for life, right? An animal dies and it attracts life. It is surrounded by life, right? So we could say actually the being along with death, it is how you sustain life, but also, and you put it brilliantly, right? Like when we think about creation, it's annihilation, creation. After the creation has finished being done with its work, it falls back into annihilation, and so on and so on. So it's not always being towards death, as Heidegger would think, is that actually with every annihilation there is creation. And I think this kind of goes along with your intrinsic motivation, is that, in order to sustain this, you actually do need that intrinsic motivation.
Yes.
Because you'd understand that with every annihilation there is creation, and then that even the annihilation itself becomes annihilated, which is the creation itself coming into being.
That's right. No. Well, because the sustaining question is the intrinsic motivation, because what is intrinsically motivating is its own mover. And so it sustains itself in that. And by having intrinsic motivation be engendered, beget by near-death experience, well, then it is taking seriously Heidegger, but not in a manner, but in a manner that has emotional weight and impact and pushes you into community so that you can be nearer to death and have a greater near-death experience. I love the phrase near-death experience, because if I ask you, what does near-death experiences mean to you? You think of oh, that's, you see God, there's like light, you kind of associate, you could even say associate the ayahuasca, the drug things that people will experience, they kind of go together. But, Cadell will talk about the problem of you have the ayahuasca experience and then you come down and you're like, well, I still have to go to work. What do I do here, right? And even though that experience can be very enriching and very important in the same freaking way that taking seriously Heidegger can be very enriching and very important, there is now the question of the sustain, the reminder of that. And the thing is, a danger of having that transcendent experience be located in the drug or the ayahuasca or whatever, is that does not, that could be you. That could be in self-relating negativity. You can just take it to yourself, right? And so it doesn't pull you out of the self-relating negativity necessarily, right? But if you locate that near-death experience in the you, well, now the near-death experience transcendence, if you will, pulls you into communion out of the self-relating negativity, ergo hell, as Trey is describing. So it is very, very important where we locate the source of our transcendent experience. Because if we locate it in an ego-to-ego experience or I-it experience or whatever and so forth, then we are going to come to believe that transcendent experiences can be found in the I-it. And certainly they can. There's no doubt that ayahuasca and different things can have these experiences. But the danger of having in that, it becomes very tempting to stay in that. And therefore, to not have Hegelian progress, therefore it reaches back and it's not progress at all because you didn't continue the phenomenological journey. That's the danger. The danger of, say, the ayahuasca and whatever, if I'm saying that correctly, is precisely that it works. It's not that it doesn't work. In fact, it can be extremely positive experience. That's actually a danger, though, because you're getting an extremely positive experience in an I-it, or just to yourself, I is I, if you will, therefore removing the incentive to go into communion, and therefore will not necessarily combat atomization, pluralism, and all these different problems that people have in knowing how to relate, right? But if ayahuasca, though, just like death in Heidegger, can be a stage toward the near-death experience of the you, well, then it can be very valuable. And maybe the only way you're able to get there to the near-death experience is precisely because of the ayahuasca. But the notion that to stress is that the near-death experience has entirely different emotional connotations and thought than the language of death, right? Death is annihilation and cessation. That is not going to sustain us. What you need to use is the language of the near-death experience, which Buber is locating in the you. And that you can even say, like when Trey was talking about Christianity, there is a very real sense in which what is Christ? A near-death experience. What is God in Christianity? One big near-death experience, with the crucifix, and he nearly died, but then he was resurrected. There is something of what death is in Christianity that is not mere annihilation. It is always near death. Death in Christianity is always near death. If I'm just speaking out of that tradition, because even people that go to hell don't die, right? They have an eternity in hell, right? If you believe in that. So there's no death in Christianity. There's only near death. What's really funny is actually, in a real sense, in most religions, there's actually not death. There's only near death, right? So, and yet we come to talk about this kind of annihilation death, which is actually, you see, one of the problems with modernity is when you throw out religion, it becomes very difficult to have a near-death experience, actually. That was what religions could provide, is a near-death experience. Whereas once you throw out, God and religion, you end up with death. And so Heidegger's like, well, can death have the weight? And certainly it can have. And actually, a great problem with many religious people is they use near-death experience to avoid death, right? They'll say like, well, no one's going to die and we don't have to worry about death. But here's the funny thing. You need to go through death. You need to go through Heidegger to get to near-death experience. If you put near-death experience before death, you're missing the order. It's like we were saying earlier, so everything goes to heck, and that's not very good. But if you go through death, now you need to go to the near-death experience. That's the step on the phenomenological journey, if you will. And for what Buber is saying is that the only way to really find that experience cannot be located in the individual reflecting on death. It has to be found in the IU. That's the only place you're going to find it. And you must find it, is what Buber wants to say.
Yes. You must find it. I think a lot of these ideas about the death has to do with a lot of rebuttals about our notion of infinite, right? Infinite has become a big problem. But what's interesting enough is that you still find some type of failure when you try to say, look, there's no infinite, there's just finite, right?
Right.
And then, of course, we come into the problem with Heidegger that we actually say, well, it's actually impossible to think or to emotionally contemplate death without some near-death experience. But that near-death experience would actually be the little exposure of, I'm going to put Lacanian terms here, of the real, of the infinite,
Yes.
right? Because the infinite, in my opinion, would be such an abyss that you'd be like, oh my God, I'm dying, you know, right? I'd be like, I'm about to be obliterated. Now your point on ayahuasca is a very good point. And I think even Young points this out, right? If you are in an I-it relationship and you haven't done the work, the preparation, you succumb to what Young had called godlikeness, where you think you are the
you're
God.
right. Yes, he does say, yeah.
And or you get crushed, right?
You're right. That's right. Yeah.
And so that's the problem. But I think, you know, trying to get away from the infinite is, I don't know, it almost seems like it's futile, because honestly, if you see how people behave, right, you can say, well, without religion, we're not including the infinite. But actually that infinite becomes reflected into our own self-contradiction, where we try to maintain some type of infinite life through technology and so on, but actually we are falling into Freud's own death drive, and we are killing ourselves, ironically, as we try to sort of maintain this ideal of infinite sustaining life and so on. So even though I know Heidegger acknowledges this, right, that humanity is always trying to portray some type of infinite, whether religious or not. And so actually the solution is just accept your whole finitude, and then, you know, and that will sort of be authentic being towards death. But actually, I think the only way to sort of have an authentic, I think this is the better way, to have a good infinity, and this is where I think it's useful to bring Heidegger here, is to actually have, and I think this is the point of Heidegger here, is to have a good finitude. What does it mean to have a good finitude? And I think that is something we haven't answered through the centuries of, you know, theology and everything, is we keep talking about infinity, but the question is, how do we have a good finitude that can encounter a good finity? I mean, a good infinity. So yeah.
St. Augustine warned that evil was a misordered good, that there was no such thing as evil because God doesn't make evil. If you have evil, it has to be a result of a misordering. This is a very profound concept, and what we've done basically in the history of philosophy is we've thought, either emphasize, you know, it's all been either or, basically, not order. And so basically what it becomes is the insight of Hegel is, I think, Augustine in this sense, on a stress on order. And I think there is a stress on order. Now that's a topic. The problem is putting infinity before finitude. Well, then you get an effacement, right? You know, I make that distinction between negation and effacement. If you put infinite in front of finitude, you get an effacement. But if you have autonomous finitude without a sense of the infinite, you get an effacement. Because if you think about it, what is finitude right now? Right now, you know, it's nothing but this. And you see, you cannot live on nothing but this. And so, like, no one actually believes in radical finitude, because radical finitude would get you to, like, the Planck length or something like that, right? You know, it would get you to, and that was kind of a Bergerson. You know, Bergerson, when he was talking about, like, duration, the problem of duration and out in Einstein's time and block time and all that different stuff, is he actually, like Zeno's paradoxes, was trying to point to the impossibility of making space primary over time. Okay. That's an entirely different subject. I'm no Bergerson expert. I'm frightened to even bring up his name because of my lack of real understanding of his thought. But what I understand of Mr. Bergerson is he wants to suggest basically that it like this whole split of finitude and infinite is a result of emphasizing space over time. Like, if you begin to say that actually space is a function of time, not time a function of space, then it makes no sense to split up finitude and infinite, because finitude is a spatial term, actually, and infinite is a temporal term, actually. Like when the mind talks about finitude, it naturally associates finitude with space. But when you start talking about infinity, your brain's going to time. You may not directly say that, but that's what your brain does. So you're actually switching the kind of the thing that you are describing in a manner that means they're not even related, like they're different. And yet we say they're the opposites. No, they're different in kind. They can't be opposite if they're different in kinds. The only way to make finitude and infinite have anything to do with one another is by making space secondary to time, and they're both properties of time. Well, once you do that, then the finite is in the infinite, and the infinite is in time, is in the finite. You see what I'm saying? And the finite is always developing into the infinite, because you could say infinite is infinitude, right? Infinitude with the IA in parentheses, and it is the development of the spatial moment in time as time. So once you get that finitude is a property of time, and that infinity is a property of time, well, then they become properties of the same thing. So the mistake arises in trying to associate finitude with space, infinity with time, and then saying, which comes first. So the issue is, though, but what that means, though, is that our vehicle into the infinite is the finite, right? The present moment, because time, this is the big Bergson thing, and actually this is what Buber's getting at as well. The present is all time, right? Like the present is the divide. You cannot divide. The moment you start talking about past, present, and future, you have treated time spatially, okay? You've treated time spatially. You divided it according to the development of space, right? No. You cannot do that. Remove space. Well, then all time becomes present. Present becomes the fullness of time is the present. And that the future is constituted by the past, and it all goes together, and that would need elaboration. But the present becomes time. And that's what Buber was trying to do. And Buber was basically like, hey, the only way to actually emotionally feel the fullness of time is in the IU. You can sit down in your office all day long and tell yourself that you get the fullness of time and that the present is all there is. And you can tell yourself you do, but you really don't, because you're just intellectualizing it in terms of an I. No. You go out and you try to have an IU. Then you might get the fullness of time. Then you might get that the infinity and the finite are two sides of the same coin. Until you do that, you're engaged in self-delusion. And actually, you're trying to avoid the real. You're engaging in that Lacan gap. You're trying to avoid the near-death experience with the idea of the near-death experience. And so basically, if we go back to the principle of order, what has happened is a lot of history, if it's been overly theological, has put the infinite before the finite, which then, of course, treats the infinite as spatial. You're actually treating it as space and something separatable by the finite. Well, you get an effacement. What we understand is that you have to go through the fullness of the finitude to see in it the fullness of infinity. Heidegger helps us do that. Being toward death can help us do that. But to sustain that place that Heidegger can get us, it needs to move into the IU. And that's what Buber would have us do. And it has to move into community. It is only in community can we sustain the emotion of the infinite and the finite being two sides of the same thing. Whereas outside of community, we can have the idea, but we cannot sustain the emotion, which is what life ultimately is, what we live. We all live our emotions before we live our ideas. And emotions cannot be reduced to mere feelings. They are also intellectual endeavors and intellectual sorting mechanisms. The only way to sustain in the two sides of finite and infinite as an emotion is in the IU.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I always look at emotion as like something that is an inexpressible idea that has not found an opening to sort of be intellectualized yet, but it is always already in the midst of being intellectualized, as you are already in the midst of the emotion itself, and so on. And I think that is what I think this actually exposes the contradiction of like two ideas that, yeah, I get it intellectually, but I don't get it emotionally, right? That emotionally is not just a feeling, that emotionally is another idea that possibly says otherwise.
Yes.
It may indicate that there is something otherwise than what is being said. And this is what actually improves relations,
Yes.
in my opinion, right? Because if you are strictly philosophical, someone may not read philosophy and be able to intellectualize their ideas, but but obviously the person is getting upset, maybe, or getting frustrated. That is already exposing the irritation of the idea that cannot find expression.
Yes.
Right. But yes, I think you're absolutely correct.
Well, often an emotion will be the expression of an idea that cannot come out linearly. That has to be taken as a whole. Well, you can't put that into language because language is inherently linear, therefore it can only be felt. And I am yet to be shown an emotion that doesn't light up a sector of the brain. I have never seen emotion that has nothing to do with the brain. If someone would like to present this, I'd like to see it. So there's never been an emotion that doesn't light up the brain. So it's quite silly to think that emotion doesn't have something to do with the brain and ergo thoughts, and that there is something about thought to do with emotion. The issue, actually, this is another order thing. So the problem is that people have tried to skip thinking and go to emotion. Well, then you end up with emotionalism, right? You have to go through thinking like a stage in the phenomenological journey to get to the place where you can have emotional intelligence. And emotion, like you could even make a distinction if you wanted between something like sensation and emotion. And emotion would be deeper. Emotion would be what comes before you in the IU, the experience of beauty, where say a sensation is the irritation that results when your coworker forgot to bring you the Big Mac you asked from Burger King. I don't think the sensation of irritation is equivalent in kind to the emotion of beauty. Like this is a big problem I think we have. Like we really don't see as a difference between say awe and irritation. They're all like on the same kind of, they're all emotions, right? That's how we put it. I feel as if this is a problem because even if there is something to do, even if sensation has something to do with emotion, sensation, as I am describing it here, seems very much less than the emotion of the IU. Like if I say, what does it feel like to encounter the you? Good luck describing that. It's going to be a ton of words. You can't really put it. But if I say, what is it like to, have someone come up behind you and tap you on the shoulder that you didn't know was there? You would say, oh, it's frightening. Be very quick. You would say frightening, right? You wouldn't even blink. Because when I ask you to describe a sensation, it's easy, right? But if I ask you to describe what is it like to listen to Mozart? What is it like to be in love? What is it like to encounter the you? I bet you'll pause. I bet you'll use a bunch of words. I bet you'll spend a lot of time thinking about it. That is a hint that these experiences are not the same, even if they have something to do with one another. The fact with a sensation, I can so easily go bam, but when I ask you to tell me about like beauty or love or whatever, you go, give me a minute. That right there says that these are not the same. But we in our thinking have conflated them. And as a result of conflating them, we have then said, oh, that's just emotion, right? That's just sensation. Encounters of beauty are just sensation, right? Love is just emotion, right? And conflated, and we're all very, very confused about it. Whereas when you start saying, no, there's a difference between sensation and emotion, and there's something about emotion that involves the mind, is intellectual, has a philosophical depth, then maybe we would have avoided what I think is possibly the greatest mistake of the 20th century is the abolishment and death of aesthetic philosophy. Because basically aesthetic philosophy is dead now. Roger Scruton passed, we're screwed. There is no robust aesthetic philosophy because nobody knows what to do with it, because basically all of beauty became subjectivity. And this is where I'm describing something like the beauty of Dasein, if I wanted to use that language, not the sensation of a subject. And you see, but if we don't have that robust distinction, we therefore throw out beauty. Beauty does not have any philosophical weight. Well, if beauty doesn't have any philosophical weight, how are you going to get to your freaking near-death experience? Like one of the reasons the near-death experience has this bam is because you go, oh, that's a really emotional experience. That's a really beautiful experience. That's a really like earth-shattering experience of sublime. That's the other big word, right? Like Kant and all them, the sublime. Near-death experience brings out the sublime. Laws of aesthetic philosophy, there's no sublimity. If there is no sublimity, then there's no room for the IU relation because the IU is sublime when it is a sublime experience. And therefore, what happens today is everyone's, talking about relations in community, but there's no sublimity in these. You have organizations, but you do not have community because you do not have the IU, because you do not have beauty. And there's no possibility of an experience of the sublime with other people because they're just associates. And this is metamodernity.
You made a really good point because this is what's funny about when we talk about art, right? Everyone could say, well, it's just all subjective, da-da-da-da. But you know what? Actually, saying it's all subjective is kind of a cheap shot in the sense of, why is it subjective? Why is it?
Yes, exactly.
Why is it the fact that when I look at a piece of art, someone gets a different impression than I do?
Yes, exactly.
What does that mean? It's not subjective because it means, in fact, the very fact that there is different subjectivities and different impressions while looking at the same object,
Yes.
it means that that thing is in itself unpossessable.
Exactly. This is critical.
And it proves how relation itself is superior than the subjectivity itself.
Yes.
Right? Because that would account for why there's so much subjectivity around one single object, and nobody can agree on why, this is a good art or a bad art and it has things missing, is because you're already entering into a relation with the object itself. And so, of course, to enter into relation with a piece of art, you have to sort of allow yourself to be present. Yes. And let it make an impression on you. But the thing is, there's only you. There's only you. And everybody else is only going to ever be another you that gets a different impression from the art. Yes. And actually, this kind of goes back to one of the critiques of the positive nihilism on Heidegger. He actually says that Heidegger, and I don't know exactly, if I'm not sure about this critique because I'm still reading Being and Time, so I'm a little bit, I don't know, but I'm just going to say it. This is just what Land is saying, that he says that Heidegger doesn't acknowledge absolute selfhood, that absolute selfhood is something that is unique, non-reoccurring, and unrepeatable. Mm-hmm. That Heidegger only quantifies the eyes, but does not qualify the eye. So I'm not entirely sure if that is so much validated, but I do think there is something to be said about how there is a uniqueness to the selfhood, mm-hmm. and it doesn't matter what exactly stage that selfhood is in, either in the ego, it, or the ego, suchness and everything like that. But it does expose something about why is there a unique individual that is non-recurring, non-repeatable. That would mean that Dasein in itself has a constitution of its own uniqueness. But again, how do we think uniqueness? The only way that I can think of it theologically is that there must be something in relation that allows uniqueness to exist that is non-repeatable, non-recurring. But yeah, that's just my thoughts right now on that.
Well, a few things. First, art is the revelation that the correct mode is witness. Yes. And suchness is that as well. Heidegger, that's why I'm always art is the revelation, beauty is the revelation that possession is not the correct mode. So that's why you need Heidegger. You need to learn that witness is the correct mode. And then after once you have the I such, now you can go to what? The IU. You could not go to the IU before you learned and truly experienced in a manner that you will sustain, which only occurs if it's emotional. We don't sustain. Ideas alone are not what sustain us. Emotions. There has to be an emotional component. Sustainability is an emotional matter. So that's why you have to do the process. You have to go through the process because you cannot think yourself into an emotion. It'd be nice if you could. You can remember things that cause emotion, but what is a memory? It's an experience that you have an idea about. So you have to experience emotion. You cannot think yourself into an emotion without actually engaging in memory. And I'm not saying memory is bad, but memory is experience-based. So Heidegger is so Heidegger, it's very important that Heidegger has located himself after Nietzsche, right? He's like, Nietzsche was the end of Western philosophy. Nietzsche has been in the business of the cultivation of the subject, right? And so that's why, in the graph I'm saying, so I think probably do need to add ego, IZI, I'll have to think of it, but it's ego, it, and then it becomes I, it. So that's Nietzsche. Nietzsche and Kierkegaard are like, boom, we figured out how to develop the ego to the I. Heidegger comes along and he's like, hey guys, just because you figured out how to make the ego turn into the I does not mean you've escaped the mode of possession, okay? So what we need to do is bracket out the question of the I and the subject, focus on Dasein, to engage in a way of thinking that is going to teach us how to transform it into suchness, ergo make everything art, basically, which will then be the revelation of the proper mode of Dasein, which is witness and not possession. Now that you've learned, so you get to the end of Heidegger and you're like, all right, you learned that. Okay, well, now you can go back, you can work backwards, back from Dasein, back to subject. Now you're a subject that is able to witness. Okay, well, now you can move to you because you're carrying in you Dasein as the subject that learned from Nietzsche. Well, now you can go into Buber. Now you can go to IU. And that would be the transition from self-consciousness to reason in Hegel. Then reason is going to get us into spirit. Spirit gets us to religion, all of which is community, just like, that Trey was saying. And absolute knowing, following a Zizekian take, is going to be the state where community at the very deepest level is seen as yourself, and that you accept the limits of your inability to ever fully grasp that, to fully get what that means, but you remain open to that community, even given your absolute limit. But the only way you will ever sustain a place of that absolute knowledge is if you've gone through the quest, if you've gone through the journey, because otherwise you will not have the emotion to sustain you in that place of absolute knowing, of which makes the community you.
Yes, and that's why I've always liked Thomas Wynn's statement of becoming what you already are. I think Michelle had sent me a reflection about, well, how is it that we would already be what we are when we're sort of going through like bitterness and everything else of these are sort of emotional endeavors, and I actually responded that actually this is the whole point, actually, right? You cannot actually know that you are already what you were before,
yes,
without going through the journey to have this retroactive realization that you already are, right?
Yes.
Like you can't, you need the journey. And that's why I think The Alchemist, and I know people hate the book sometimes, but it's a big debate online why The Alchemist is a good book and why The Alchemist is a horrible book. But in my opinion, The Alchemist, if someone is watching this and never wants to get into reading Hegel, The Alchemist is basically Hegel in a very nice narrative form, in terms of like, you go through this journey and then you realize as you return that you already had what you were looking for in the beginning of that journey, right? But in order for you to sort of have discovered that, you need to have gone through the journey itself in order to realize that. So it is, and I think this is why I love Buber's statement that that potential being is actual being.
Sure.
That's what I love about his statement, is that potential being is actual being, because it actually does play on that term of becoming what you already are. It is that useful play of that. But of course, like we said before, you cannot intellectualize this and say, okay, I'm already what I am. No, you're not. You're not what you already are, because you don't know that.
Right.
You don't know that at all. And you have to go through the journey itself. And I think, to even go back to the net that we were talking about, why do we encounter specific thinkers? I actually think encountering specific thinkers is actually similar to encountering specific stages within our own self about something that sort of helps us along the journey and realizing what we already are. So, my obsession with Buber is already exposing that sort of, that opening of like, I'm already getting glimmers without realizing that I'm getting the glimmers as I am progressing through the journey, until like I come across like a near-death experience. Then I sort of realize like, oh my God, like, wow, here I am.
Well, so a few things. There's a sense, so everyone talks about the Joseph Campbell hero's journey, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a sense in which up to Nietzsche is the hero's journey. Then you get to Nietzsche, now you need the suchness journey, the ability to develop the ability to do suchness. Now you get there, now you're ready for the IU journey to absolute knowing. So it's like what ends up happening problematically is people only describe one journey. So the thing is, so if we learn from Hegel that the development of the subject, the individual, whatever language, all of these are charged and dangerous to use, but whatever. if one learns from Hegel a stageal development of the individual, you can then work backwards and understand through that lens. You can then understand Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Buber together, because you take that revelation from Hegel and then you say, okay, rather than think it's either like the hero's journey or it's Heidegger, and that's what we end up tending to do. It's one of the others. We say, oh, the hero's journey is what you need to go on to get to the place where now you've turned the ego into an I. All right, you've done that. But now you've got to go on the suchness journey, which means which actually, I meant to say this. This is really hard because you did all of this work to make the ego an I. And then Heidegger comes along and he says, yeah, we're going to have to move that aside for a bit. And it's really, really hard. He's like, yeah, you as a subject, you've done pretty good. You moved as the ego into the I. That was great. But Western philosophy, if we stay in this stage, it's not going to work. And in fact, it's going to deconstruct itself. This entails a dying to self. To transition from Nietzsche to Heidegger is a dying to self because you turn the ego into an I. And now you're being told that you have to put aside all that work you did. Screw that. Heidegger's a Nazi. So you don't want to go into all that. But Heidegger's like, no, trust me. If you are an I that does not, if you stay an I, all you will ever do is be I it. You must get to the place where you can have I suchness, because that is the mode of learning, that witnessing, that is the mode in which the I witnesses as opposed to the I possesses. But guess what that means? You have to die to your possession of the I that you just earned. Because how will you ever enter a mode of witnessing if you're not able to die to the possession of the I? So Heidegger's like, come over to Dasein, give up your I, move the subject aside. Oh, you're in Dasein. Well, let's keep going. Let's keep going. You got to the place where the suchness of being can hit you. You've now learned. Now you can go back to now the I as subject. You can bring the subject back after you go through Heidegger, because now it's possible for I it to be I such. But then Buber comes along, and Buber's like, oh, well, that's great. You got to the place where you learn to witness. Oh, that's so great. You've learned how to look at a tree, and really the near-death experience and beauty of it strikes you in the sublimity. That's great. Now we're going to go see a person. What? Yeah. And people aren't like trees. They have feelings, and they're different, and they're difficult, and they're really hard. And that's why you wanted to possess. That's why you would have possessed them without Heidegger. Because when you encounter difference, we all try to possess it and smother it and get rid of it because difference sucks. No matter how much we talk about liking diversity, no matter how much we talk about individuals and whatever, when we encounter true diversity, we come up with some moral justification to get rid of it. And yet we still love diversity somehow, even as we kill diversity. We always play those self-delusions. But so Buber comes along and he's like, hey, now that you've gained the mode of witness, you're ready for the possibility of IU. And because you went from ego I, you may have the internal resources to handle this encounter of the IU. And so then you go through the Buber quest, and then you really feel the difficulty of the IU, but you might be able to sustain it because Heidegger has trained you out of the habit of possessing. So now you can witness. So when you're tempted to possess the you and thus reduce it to an I it, Heidegger has given you the training and resources to not do that. So you don't do that. And then Hegel comes along because you got the IU, and he's like, hey, you did it. You did the IU. I would like you to really deeply become you. I want you to integrate with otherness to the point where it is in your very being. I want you to become other. Oh, and I also want you to accept your absolute limit in your ability to ever fully grasp what I'm telling you to do, because you are stuck in a self-relating negativity that can never possess it. So I really want you, really, really, really want you to really die to yourself at every possible level, even as a self that was capable of the IU. You're going to give up even that accomplishment, just like Heidegger coming after Nietzsche and saying, hey, I'd like you to give up that I you just earned. Then Hegel comes along and said, hey, I want you to give up the accomplishment of being able to handle IU to really, really make room for the you. I want you to become otherness. And you do. And once you become otherness, if you take that Hegel, you look back at the beginning of the journey and see that you were always other. That you are always becoming other, that you are now realizing what you always are, but could not realize what you always are until you went through the process. Because it is only at the end of the process that you can see the beginning of it, and that the beginning is at the end. And it's only from the top of the mountain that there's any hope of being able to see the whole of it all around 360.
Yeah, I mean, what I like about the famous notion of God being the beginning and the end is that I always imagine it, and I think the problem that we have is we always think about, like you said, in space. We go, oh, there's the beginning, and then there's the end. But actually, that is not how it goes.
Right.
It goes, here's the beginning, here's the end. It folds on top of each other, and then you shove a pencil right through it.
That's right.
Right? And then you can no longer distinguish what is the beginning, what is the end, because it just already was. It already is.
I've never experienced this past everyone's talking about. I've never experienced this future everyone's talking about. I've never experienced it. I don't know about you.
But, you know, actually, I think the phenomenological journey and the stressing of like going from, you know, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Hegel, it is such a useful journey. But at the same time, it's like, what is it preparing us for? What is it preparing? It's preparing us for it is the subtle practices of doing nothing. It is a preparation of doing nothing, right? The first instance of trying to do nothing, what does Heidegger propose, right? Witnessing, right? Witnessing, right? This is your first step into doing nothing. And then Buber comes along and it's like, okay, now you're going to witness, but now you're going to be presented another being, right?
Yes.
But Buber is also saying, in order to do nothing, you have to be present in front of that other being, right? Now Hegel comes along and says, okay, now this notion of nothing, this preparation of nothingness is actually that you are the other. Right. You are the other.
To interrupt, because I'm very good at interrupting. Nothing can only be done now. Nothing can't be done in the future. Nothing can be done in the past. The great mistake is we say, oh, the future is nothing, or the past is nothing, which therefore makes the other nothing, not something that can occur in the present. We start talking like the present is the only time. But here's the problem. Even though there's kind of truth to that, when we say the present is the only real time, we are suggesting that there are other kinds of time that the present can be real relative toward, as opposed to it being all the fullness of time at once. So there's a trick that happens in our language that deceives us. When we say that the present is the only real time, that can imply that there are other times that are less real when they're not even there to be less real. You understand what I'm saying? So nothing only occurs in the present. Here's the funny thing. By doing nothing, if you really, really do nothing in the sense that you're describing in the annihilating, as your great conversation with Wynn was going on, if you annihilate yourself, but you're still here, then there must be some other to you, or otherwise you wouldn't be here. So annihilating unveils the ground of your being as other. If you do nothing and you are still here, then you must not be constituted in the way you thought, because you're still here after annihilating it. And that would mean there must be something that isn't willing to be nothing, that you cannot will to be nothing, because that is outside of you, which must be the other. Because when you will to annihilate yourself, you cannot simultaneously will the other to annihilate themselves, right? So you annihilate yourself, and that unveils that you're still here. So there must be an otherness that you cannot will, that you can only witness. There must be an otherness to you that you cannot possess, ergo make operate according to your will, annihilating yourself, because the other doesn't go as well. And that means there's an otherness part of you that you must witness. So annihilation, and this is what Heidegger understood. If we follow Heidegger in the annihilation, understood by the annihilation of the subject, by focusing, bracketing it out to focus on the Dasein, and then getting to the place where Dasein even annihilates itself. This is the beginning of a revelation of otherness that has to be developed more fully into Buber, but there's space for that. There's space for that because as you carry out that annihilation, actually what strangely occurs is suchness becomes, dare I say, brighter or more vivid. Well, how can that possibly be occurring? Because you're annihilating yourself. How can suchness grow as you annihilate yourself? Oh, because there's an otherness that you can only witness, that by removing your subject, you remove temptations of possession from a subconscious and unconscious, an element you don't even realize is occurring. That's why Heidegger is really emphasizing the removal of the subject, because he's like, hey, Western philosophy, even when you thought you were moving aside the subject with objectivity, it was actually just self-deception in disguise. You don't, the possessing element of you was not as deconstructed as you thought. So I'm just going to be radical about it. Heidegger's like, I'm going to be straight up radical about it, because the subject-object divide was all just a trick. It didn't really bracket out the subject. It just is where this, actually what ended up happening is the subject started calling itself objective, and now you supercharged the possessive element. Like objectivity becomes like the ultimate accomplishment of the possessive spirit. And Heidegger's like, you fell for that. So I'm going to really emphasize moving the subject aside so we can annihilate it to the place where you encounter the necessity of otherness in the revelation of suchness. And once you have that, and therefore learn that the proper mode is witnessing, not possessing, you can then go back to being a subject, because from that journey of suchness, a journey where you go and gain, where the I, after the hero's journey, the ego goes on the hero's journey to gain the I. Then the I goes on the suchness journey to gain the mode of suchness. And now it can go into the journey of the I is you. And so Heidegger provides those resources, and then you can go in the way that Buber would have you, so that you can have the near-death experience that is necessary for the full constitution of a new kind of being that is intrinsically motivated and therefore able to carry itself in the world in a manner that witnesses the world, as opposed to reduce it to standing reserve.
Yes. And I see it very clearly, this progress, because actually, if you think of like concentric circles, I think this is kind of like the revelation of the progress of the journey of becoming what you already are. It's just like these sort of concentric circles that sort of swallow us in. But to go to even to Kierkegaard, right? For Kierkegaard, the Abraham and Isaac sacrifice, right, is absurd.
Yes.
But that's only one stage.
Yes, it's a
right?
stage.
That's a stage.
That's right.
It's a stage where it is absurd, right? But actually, Ibn Arabi proposes a very interesting Hegelian move where actually the sacrifice of Isaac isn't even Isaac, because the son, and this is actually very Christian that Ibn Arabi says this, the son is the essence of the father. So actually,
Yes.
the only thing that Abraham is confronting is himself.
Right.
His otherness.
That's
you
right.
could say, right? So that is like the interesting move here from going to Kierkegaard to even like Ibn Arabi or Hegel, is that it no longer becomes absurd.
Right.
Right. You could even say that even Albert Camus' notion of absurd is just one stage of the journey, right?
Yes.
Where we have to sort of accept this absurdness, right? And then once we accept this absurdness, another death occurs, where we start realizing that actually it's not an absurdness, it is actually my own otherness that I am encountering.
Right.
Right. So I think it's, I'm trying to think what more could I say than this, but yeah.
No, I mean, what you're saying, I mean, it's all of us naturally overestimate to the degree that we easily transition from ego into I. All of us overestimate it. And you need basically the history of Western philosophy up to Nietzsche and all of the challenge of that to make that transition. It is not something that one engages with because they went to a few classes that taught them that it's important to love yourself or something. One must go through much deeper and much more rigorous undertakings that are extremely complex. That may entail, say, joining a wrestling team or doing a blue-collar job or going to college. There are many stages, and all of that would have to be elaborated. The process of the transformation of the ego into an I is incredibly difficult, and yet it's only the first stage. The transition from the natural tendency to possess to the ability to witness is something we all think we do. Who thinks they possess their lover? Who thinks they possess the world around them? Everyone knows that they're supposed to be humble, especially everyone knows they're supposed to do this. Who thinks that they possess the world around them? Very few people. And yet it is incredibly natural for us to do it. It is an incredibly difficult process and journey to move from the stage of I, it to I, suchness. You need all of Heidegger. You need all of many thinkers in order to get to that place. Who thinks they can't relate? Who thinks that they don't behold and witness the other? Who thinks they're not a good friend? Who thinks that they're not a good spouse? Who thinks that they don't honor the people that they care about in their life? And yet very few of us do. Very few of us ever get to the place where we actually make another person feel loved or embraced. It is a very difficult process. But once we have I and suchness, once we have the mode of witnessing, we can begin to enter into the possibility of I-you that Buber presents us to, and have it be a near-death experience, of which gives us an intrinsic motivation to see a beauty in life. And once we do that, who of us doesn't really think that we are just, one person in a sea of a cosmos? Who really thinks that the whole world is just us? We all know and know to say that we're just one person, and the bigger humanity is more important and the world is more. We all know to say that the community and other people, and we're supposed to sacrifice for other people and so on and so forth, and really, really treat them as we treat ourselves. Who thinks that they don't love their neighbor as their self? Who thinks they don't, to that extreme of a level where you treat the neighbor as part of your very being? And yet very few of us do. Hegel comes along and says you must, because they have always already been you. And now you're at the place where you can see what has always been the case if you're just open your eyes. And now you're in a place where the blind can see. So what do you see? And so we live our lives.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very good stopping point to culminate everything that we've been talking about with Buber, Heidegger, Nietzsche. I almost want to say, even if we bring in Nietzsche, that actually the metamorphosis of the camel, the lion, and the child, that itself is always a sort of, it's funny about, I've been thinking about this, and I wanted to run this by you because I thought it'd be really funny, right? Actually, I think there's a certain stage in which actually the camel would realize in relation that there's always been a camel rider, right? And that the lion in relation would always realize that there's a lion tamer, and that the child in relation would realize there's also always a parent, father figure, a parent figure in that relation, right? But it's through those relations that we fall back constantly on the metamorphosis of becoming the camel, the lion, and the child, right? Or even through the relation of the parent, you see yourself in the child, right? And I wonder if that exact metamorphosis is supposed to be that, right? Where eventually you see yourself in the child, right? Not just becoming the child, but through the relation is that the child eventually becomes an adult and sees himself in the child, and then falls back again to go once more through the burden of another metamorphosis of going through the camel and so on. But yeah, I think that is all. But to me, in my opinion, it's already carried in the Christian event, in my opinion, right? I think I wrote a paper on this where I said that actually the death of Christ is the most anti-Christ thing. The event itself is anti-Christ in the sense that actually all we can ever do is prepare ourselves for the event, the anti-Christ, where I'm actually starting to think that actually values are themselves. It's a very interesting phrasing in the Bible where it says Christ takes upon all the sins of mankind and sort of annihilates himself through the crucifixion, right? But it's very interesting because I did a tie with the camel and the metamorphosis where I said that actually Jesus does this thing where he becomes the camel, carries all the values. The crucifixion is the lion sort of swiping at the values, negating all those values, the forgiveness of sins, and then the rebirth, the resurrection, the child, Jesus in another body, but it's a likeness of a body. It's very similar to eternal reoccurrence and everything, but yeah.
Well, every human being that has ever been on planet Earth was a child, but not every human being was an adult. Not every human being was a teenager. The child is universal. If there was a human, there was a child. And so by Nietzsche ending on the child, he does in fact end with a universal. Had it been an adult, well, not everyone is an adult. Not everyone lives so long. And God showing up as a child, as opposed to, say, just straight up as an adult in Jesus, then he shows up in the universal character. And what is the universal character? Every single human being who has ever existed was vulnerable and helpless. And yet they were sustained. Because if they weren't sustained, they wouldn't be here now. And they were sustained to some point. And in fact, the children who did not become adults were not sustained. And that's the great tragedy. The great tragedy, what we consider one of the greatest losses, is the death of a child, right? Like, there's almost nothing worse than that. Like, yes, it's terrible if a 40-year-old dies, and that's young, but we would go, well, but if a 12-year-old dies or an 8-year-old dies, we go, my gosh, this is truly horrible. It's hard to see something worse, because one of the universal character, that's one of the part of it. It's like we were all that, and yet it was an unrealized universal character, if you will. And because it feels like it was cut off too short before it had a chance to go through the journey of life. In a very real sense, all of humanity, by not going through this full phenomenological journey that we are describing, the majority of the human race has died as children. The majority of the human race has died the most tragic of deaths, because they haven't even gotten from the ego to the I. Very, very young. What Nietzsche is suggesting is a world in which everyone in a universal character starts in absolute knowing, where the child in the universal, the knowing of seeing oneself in all, in the infinite creative potentiality of that state of what it could be, in the creation of which could follow, is what Nietzsche wants to emphasize at the end. And in that, of course, the end is in the beginning. And the child, of whom makes it to the end and sees himself in the beginning, from there, was sustained there. And as we have been discussing this entire evening, the only way that we can sustain ourselves in this journey, this multi-tier journey we have been describing, is through the annihilation of the self, so that the revelation of the other comes through. Because the other that we witness as a result of the mode of suchness is what then emotionally sustains us forth to be the child of whom at the end sees the beginning in the universal character and realizes that God shows up as a child and that he has entered the world no other way.
Yeah, I think you actually answer that. We cannot even approach becoming unless there is that emotional sustainability.
Yes.
To continue. And that is where obviously probably you and I and Trey would all go into the theological realm, because there has been enough hints at how we could cultivate this emotional sustainability towards becoming. But, I would leave it to the others that don't want to go into that realm to sort of answer the emotional gap that would be left towards, like, of course, we all understand that there's always becoming. There's always negation of negation going on. But again, like you've been pointing out, is that how can you sustain the negation of the negation without that emotional you could say experience, right?
Yes.
And that's the problem, right? It's so easy to intellectualize the negation of the negation. I fully understand it.
Sure.
Let me tell you, I don't think that I can. I don't think I can actually live it.
You're getting at something beyond important. In the same way that we have been suggesting that if one does not get to the end of the journey, it's as if there was no progress at all. It becomes an effacement, right? We've been saying that. Philosophy, by not transitioning into the question of motivation, is as if philosophy is all a mistake. Because if you do not question, in my opinion, the great basically sin of philosophy is ignoring the question of motivation, which has been left to economists, are the main ones who take that up, questions of incentive structures or so on and so forth. Theology understood that philosophy without motivation would function simply as a manner of self-deception. It would tell you that you are practicing negation of negation as you're not, because you have the idea, and having an idea feels like you're doing it. Having the idea of the negation of negation, having the ideas of Nietzsche, of Hume, etc., Kierkegaard, feels like you do it. But it is not doing it. theology tended to be very aware that knowing the law made people not practice the law. It tended to know that ethics and knowing ethics tended to make people not do ethics. And in fact, became what? A force of power, a force of control, a way to manipulate. Religion knew that very well. And in fact, religion could not even help itself but get pulled into that mechanism. That is how strong it is. The power of human beings to take good ideas and use them in service of evil is basically omnipotent. There seems to be no limit to the amount of skill and dexterity and power that human beings have to take good ideas and put them in service of the bad. The only way to stop that is motivation, and to take seriously the question of motivation, because motivation inherently works against self-deception. This is what the economists understood. You may think you have the best business on planet Earth, so we're going to create a test that you're going to have to enter into, where you're going to have to face the fact that your idea of what constitutes a good toilet is not very good because no one wants to buy it. So economics comes into development with one, creating systems of incentives, and what is overlooked is tests against self-deception or just honest error. You genuinely believed that your invention was useful. It wasn't self-deception. You generally believed it, but then there was a market test that made you realize it was not. So there has to be an entire system of testing, working against self-deception and motivation. And also, if we take capitalism as an example, it's like, yeah, human beings suck. So how do we combine together self-interest and self-regulation? Because if you don't do that, humans will naturally not self-regulate and in fact steal and be terrible. So capitalism's like create a structure of incentives, a basic, you make money only if the customer's happy. Therefore, you have to regulate your behavior to make the customer happy. Therefore, there's a combination of self-interest and self-regulation. It's an entirely another subject, but the reason capitalism today has fallen into what I call corporatism is because there have been mechanisms of mixed market to separate self-interest and self-regulation, where you can gain your self-interest without regulating your behavior, ergo too big to fail. If you're too big to fail, you don't have to regulate your behavior because you can't fail. You can just follow your self-interest. So once you don't have the threat of bankruptcy, self-interest and self-regulation go together. Separate. Different subject. But basically, philosophy has left questions of motivation to the economists, and philosophy has acted as if ideas are in of themselves motivating. That if you know Nietzsche, you will then be motivated to live Nietzsche. And well, maybe you will for a year. Maybe you will for a few months. But sustaining that? Theology's like, that's way harder. In order to sustain that, you might need like a communion every Sunday. You might need networks of people that are helping at the homeless. You may need accountability networks. You may need confession booths. Like to actually sustain you in your I-ness and suchness, you may need an entire way of life that has regular checks and balances to keep you there. And so theology entered into the creation of the church. Orthodoxy naturally led into orthopraxy, because you have to create a system to sustain the orthodoxy and to make sure people are living it, or otherwise the orthodoxy will come to be in service of self-deception. That's what ends up happening. Here's the issue. Philosophy has struggled very much to give itself an orthopraxy, if you will, to create, it has its orthodoxy per se, but it really struggles with orthopraxy because the religious element, because it is very, very difficult to motivate people to sustain Nietzsche if there's no God. If there's no ultimate sort of transcendent motivating factor, it becomes very difficult. I don't want to say it's impossible. I don't want to say it cannot be done. And I don't want to say that, it's a fool's errand. That's an open question. That is a big conversation. The point that I will end on is simply that philosophy has not appreciated the difficulty of motivation. I think economics has. I think theology has. Philosophy has not. And in not taking that seriously, you're basically not ready for Buber. You're not ready for IU, because you will never, ever be motivated to stay in the place of the purgatory that you must go through to get to IU, because that's really, really hard. Even if you learn Heidegger, even if you get the suchness, to actually get to the IU, you'll be like, that suchness experience was really nice. I'm going to go back to that. That's what you'll end up doing. Once you start to get, you have to go through Sartre in I suchness to get to Buber. And once you encounter that Sartre-ness, you're going to be like, this sucks. The suchness was great. I'm going to go back to that. And you will isolate yourself from the world, and you will be more just integrated with suchness. You will not return to common life, as Hume would have us do. To push through the temptation of staying in the suchness, the temptation of the ayahuasca, the great experience, to actually push through, theology has better resources for doing that. And philosophy is yet to prove itself able to generate those resources. But that is its current task. And I wish it all the best.
Yes. And just to briefly comment on, your motivation, I think is a very good point. I mean, this is why I'm really liking Maslow's concept of growth motivation, where I think actually the concept of motivation, now that I'm sort of starting to really think, is that motivation typically has a goal in mind, sort of status quo that wants to be reached. But actually that is, I think, in my opinion, what Maslow would say is just a deficiency need, right? It's a deficiency. It's your goal is aimed for consumption. But actually a growth motivation, a real growth motivation that Maslow would say, is actually you are so motivated that the growth itself is motivating. Right.
That's
that is
intrinsic
actually
motivation.
You have no goal in mind. It is the growth itself that is the goal, that is constantly feeding itself. And it is like when Michelle shared to me that poem from Rumi, which I think Rumi is absolutely correct. It is the longing of the longing itself.
Yes.
Right. That is, in my opinion, the real cultivation of intrinsic motivation. It is that longing for the longing itself. There is no goal per se, because once you get caught up in a goal, you get caught up in a consumption, right? You want to stay there. You're like, I'm happy. I've reached a point of static, a static goal and communion. But that would be not motivational in its true character. That would be only sort of consumption.
Yes.
I think what you're getting at is very important about this.
Well, for me, the language that Wilke and different people use on growth is very good. I have avoided growth because it has been so captured by GDP growth and endless growth and all those different things. So I've kind of used intrinsic motivation because motivation is not a language that has been so captured by economic standards. One of the reasons I lean toward when I was talking about that you relating negativity as opposed to you relating sublation or whatever, one of the reasons I kind of like the negativity is because it's a longing for a longing. It has a sort of the negation is never fully sublimated into even something new. Like it is at that point, the sublation is the you relating. And it has this longing of a longing character to it. Wherein, like in absolute knowing, if we take that, there is a longing for the limit. There is a longing for the very situation that is a revelation of your incompleteness, because there is something beautiful about the incompleteness itself. Like there is actually a longing for the incompleteness, because it is only that incompleteness that unveils a certain quality and character of beauty that can be found in no other way. You know, Christianity would say the only way God can reach full beauty is if he has holes in his hand, if he has scars on his back. If God does not have scars on his back, there is a kind of beauty, truth, and goodness that will be lacking, that is actually fuller than a God who does not have scars. You know, a God who has scars is one who has participated in the pain of man and is actually greater for that pain than a God who did not. Now, whether we agree with that claim, obviously some people do not agree with that claim, but the idea, at least, is that it is actually the scar of God. A God with cuts is greater than a God without cuts. A God with cuts is more beautiful. And so likewise, the notion is that the being of whom's final point is an absolute knowing, and therefore an incompleteness with the in parentheses, entails a beauty that is greater in character somehow than a completeness without the in. That's the claim. That's certainly the claim of Christianity, that actually the beauty of incompleteness with the in parentheses is greater than the beauty of completeness. The beauty of a God with scars is greater than a God without scars. That's the claim of Christianity. If one accepts it or not, that's their prerogative, but that's the claim. And so the longing for the longing, the self-relating negativity are the conditions that make possible intrinsic motivation. And the claim would also be that a world of intrinsic motivation that is only possible from the condition of self-relating negativity, because otherwise you couldn't have a longing for a longing. If there was completion, there would be no possibility of a longing for a longing. So self-relating negativity becomes the necessary ontological condition for the possibility of a longing for a longing, of which is the absolute knowing of incompleteness with the I in incomplete, of which is the greatest of all possible beauties. And suddenly there's if one wants to follow a Christian conception, suddenly there is a justification for why beings are self-relating negativities. Because otherwise, there'd be no possibility of a God who is scarred. And there'd be no possibility of the beauty of the longing for longing. And my closing point would be, in my opinion, with all the discussion on game B, emergent societies, and different and so forth, all of that for me basically comes down to the question of, is it possible to cultivate in mass intrinsic motivation? The ability of the world not to devour itself, not to fall into the collapse that is predicted by game B of hypermodernity. For me, all of that rests on the question of if intrinsic motivation can be cultivated in mass. If it cannot, then the Girardian apocalypse that people are talking about is what will come unto us. But if intrinsic motivation can be cultivated, if indeed we can escape the scapegoat mechanisms, mimetic desire, all these different things that we have talked about, then it may just be possible for this finitude that participates in the infinite to be itself a beatific vision. And this is the challenge of our time.
Right. Yeah, that's wonderful.
It's been a pleasure.
I think that's the perfect summary to end on.
Thank you for your time, Javier. I've enjoyed it immensely.
I really like how you capitalize on the self-relating negativity, how it sort of exposes the whole that is sort of necessary.
Yes.
For the intrinsic motivation itself.
Yes.
Right. But yeah. So with that, I'm going to cut the recording. Thank you guys for watching.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys.